Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I have been driving 18-wheelers across this country for the better part of 17 years now, and I thought I had seen just about everything the road could throw at a man. Blizzards that turned highways into skating rinks. Dust storms in West Texas that blotted out the sun at noon. Fog so thick in the Appalachians that you could not see your own hood ornament. I have driven through all of it, and I always made it to my destination in one piece. But what happened to me on a rain-soaked stretch of Highway 71 through Arkansas 3 autumns ago still makes my hands tremble when I grip the steering wheel on wet nights. It was not the storm itself that scared me, though Lord knows it was bad enough. It was what came through my CB radio during those long hours of darkness and rain, a voice that knew things it should not have known, and the terrible understanding that sometimes the road connects you to things that should have stayed buried. My name is Wade Collier, and I run freight out of Little Rock for a mid-sized outfit called Razor Ridge Transport. We haul everything from auto parts to furniture, whatever needs moving between the Mississippi and the Oklahoma border. It is honest work, and it pays the bills, though it means spending more nights in truck stop parking lots than in my own bed. I had picked up a load of agricultural equipment in Fort Smith that October evening, bound for a farm supply distributor down in Texarkana. The route was simple enough, just Highway 71 south through the Ozark foothills, maybe 4 hours if traffic cooperated and the weather held. But the weather was not holding. By the time I cleared the Fort Smith city limits around 7 in the evening, the sky had turned the color of a fresh bruise, all purple and black with that sickly yellow undertone that means serious rain is coming. The radio had been chattering about severe thunderstorm warnings all afternoon, and I could see lightning flickering on the southern horizon like artillery fire in some distant war. I should have waited it out at the truck stop on the edge of town. Any sensible driver would have grabbed dinner, found a parking spot, and let the worst of the storm blow through before hitting the road. But I was behind schedule already after spending an extra 2 hours at the loading dock dealing with paperwork problems, and my dispatcher had made it clear that this delivery needed to be there first thing in the morning. The client was one of our best accounts, the kind you do not disappoint if you want to keep getting their business. So I made the choice that has haunted me ever since. I topped off my fuel tanks, grabbed a cup of coffee and a sandwich from the convenience store, and pointed my Peterbilt south into the gathering darkness. Within 20 minutes, I knew I had made a mistake. The rain started as I passed through the town of Waldron, just a few scattered drops at first, then building quickly into a steady drumming on the roof of my cab. By the time I was 10 miles south of town, it had become a downpour that turned my windshield into a waterfall, even with the wipers on their highest setting. Highway 71 through that part of Arkansas is not a bad road during daylight and good weather. It winds through the foothills of the Ouachita Mountains, following ridgelines and valleys through country that is mostly national forest and scattered farms. But at night in a rainstorm, it becomes something else entirely. The darkness pressed in from both sides of the highway, broken only by my headlights reflecting off the curtain of rain. There were no other vehicles on the road, which was unusual even for a weeknight. Most sensible people had pulled over to wait out the storm, or they had never left home in the first place. I was alone out there with just the rain and the darkness, and the occasional flash of lightning that turned the forest into a frozen tableau of dripping trees and low-hanging clouds. The road surface was treacherous, covered with water that pooled in every low spot and sent up rooster tails behind my trailer. I kept my speed down to about 45, which was slower than I liked, but faster than was probably safe. Every few minutes, my trailer would start to drift on a patch of standing water, and I would have to ease off the throttle and fight the steering wheel to keep everything tracking straight. About an hour into this misery, I reached for my CB radio and dialed over to Channel 19, the main trucker channel. I was hoping to hear from other drivers in the area, maybe get some information about how far south this storm system extended, or whether the roads got any better down toward Mina. The radio crackled with static from the lightning, but underneath it, I could hear the faint voices of drivers somewhere out in the night. Most of it was the usual traffic, complaints about the weather, warnings about flooded low spots, questions about which truck stops still had parking spaces. I listened for a few minutes without transmitting, just taking comfort in the knowledge that there were other people out there fighting the same battle I was. Then I heard something that made me reach for the volume knob. It was a voice, male, speaking just above a whisper but somehow cutting through the static with perfect clarity. The voice said my name. "Wade Collier," it said, drawing out the syllables like it was tasting them. "Wade Collier in the blue Peterbilt. How are you holding up in this rain, Wade?" I felt a cold finger of unease trace down my spine. The voice knew my name and the color of my truck, which meant someone could see me. I checked my mirrors, looking for headlights behind me or ahead of me, but there was nothing except rain and darkness. I grabbed my microphone and keyed it, trying to keep my voice casual and friendly. "This is Wade Collier. Who am I talking to?" There was a pause filled with the hiss of static and the drum of rain on my roof. Then the voice came back, and this time there was something in it that made my skin crawl, a kind of amusement mixed with something darker. "You do not recognize my voice, Wade? That hurts my feelings. We go back a long way, you and me, a long way down this road." I did not recognize the voice at all. It was not anyone from my company, not any of the regular drivers I talked to on my usual routes. It had an accent I could not quite place, something rural and old-fashioned that reminded me of my grandfather's generation. I keyed the mic again. "I think you have got me confused with someone else, friend. I do not believe we have met." The laugh that came back was low and unpleasant. "Oh, we have met, Wade. We have definitely met. You just do not remember yet, but you will. Before this night is over, you are going to remember everything." I felt my unease deepening into something closer to fear. This was not normal CB chatter, not even the weird stuff you sometimes heard late at night when the skip was rolling and signals were bouncing in from hundreds of miles away. This was personal, and it was directed at me. I looked at my odometer and saw that I was approaching mile marker 47. The road ahead curved through a particularly dark stretch of forest, and the rain seemed to be falling even harder if that was possible. I made a decision and started slowing down, looking for a place to pull over. There was a rest area marked on my atlas about 5 miles ahead, and I decided I would wait there until this storm passed and this crazy person got bored and moved on to harass someone else. But before I could reach the rest area, the voice came back on the radio. "Do not even think about stopping, Wade. You need to keep driving. You need to keep moving south on Highway 71, just like you always do, just like you did that night." "What night?" I asked, before I could stop myself. "What are you talking about?" There was another pause. Longer this time, filled with the crackling of lightning and the whisper of rain. When the voice came back, it was quieter, more intimate, like someone leaning close to tell you a secret. "The night you killed Jonas Lyle. The night you ran him off this road and kept on driving like nothing had happened. You remember that, do not you, Wade? Or have you pushed it so far down that you actually believe it never happened?" My hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. The name Jonas Lyle meant nothing to me. I had never heard it before in my life, and I had certainly never killed anyone or run anyone off the road. This had to be some kind of sick joke, or maybe a case of mistaken identity. I was about to tell the voice exactly that when another memory surfaced, something I had not thought about in years. It had been maybe 5 years ago, maybe 6. I had been running this same route on another rainy night, though not as bad as this one. I had been younger then, more aggressive with my driving, more willing to push the limits to make good time. There had been a vehicle ahead of me that night, some kind of old pickup truck crawling along at maybe 30 miles an hour with no lights on. I had come up behind it fast, too fast, and I had leaned on my air horn to get the driver to either speed up or pull over. The truck had swerved when I hit the horn, overcorrected, and drifted toward the shoulder. I remembered seeing it fishtail once, twice, and then I had been past it, continuing south with my delivery, already putting the incident out of my mind. I had assumed the driver got the truck back under control. I had assumed everything was fine. I had never checked the news or the police reports. I had never looked back. Now, sitting in my cab with the rain hammering down and the voice whispering through my radio, I felt the cold certainty settling into my bones. That truck had not gotten back under control. The driver had not been fine. Something terrible had happened that night, and I had kept on driving. "I see you are starting to remember," the voice said, and now it sounded pleased, almost satisfied. "That old pickup, the one with the broken taillights, you came up behind Jonas doing maybe 65 in heavy rain. You hit that air horn right behind him, scared him half to death. He swerved, lost control, went off the right shoulder and down the embankment. 30-foot drop into a ravine full of rocks and water. They did not find his body for 3 days, Wade. 3 days in the rain, down in that dark hollow where nobody goes." I wanted to protest, to insist that I had not known, that it was not my fault, that the truck should have had its lights on, that the driver should have been going faster. But the words stuck in my throat because I knew the truth. I had seen the truck swerve. I had seen it go toward the shoulder, and I had kept driving. I had convinced myself that everything was fine because stopping would have meant losing time, missing my delivery window, maybe getting written up by my dispatcher. I had chosen convenience over conscience, and someone had died because of it. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The voice took its time answering, and I could hear something else in the background now, underneath the static. It sounded like rain falling, but heavier, more violent, like the rain I was driving through right now. "I want you to understand," the voice finally said. "I want you to feel what Jonas felt that night. The fear, the helplessness, the knowledge that you are going to die and there is nothing you can do about it. And then I want you to remember, Wade. I want you to remember for whatever time you have left." The radio went silent after that, just the hiss of static and the howl of the storm. I tried calling out, tried asking more questions, but there was no response. I considered turning around, heading back north to Fort Smith where there would be lights and people in safety, but something kept me moving forward, some terrible certainty that turning around would not help, that whatever was happening tonight was going to happen no matter which direction I drove. The mile markers crept past. 49, 51, 53. The rain never let up, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. I kept the radio on channel 19, listening through the static for that voice to come back, dreading it, but also needing to hear it, needing to know what was going to happen next. At mile marker 55, my headlights caught something on the right shoulder of the road. It was a vehicle, an old pickup truck with its hood crumpled and its front wheels hanging over the edge of the embankment. The truck was dark and empty, rain streaming off its bent frame. As I passed it, I saw the license plate clearly in my taillights. Arkansas tags from the early 2000s, expired years ago. The truck that Jonas Lyle had been driving that night. I should have been surprised, should have been shocked, but somehow I had known I would see it. The voice on the radio had been building to this, preparing me for this moment. I grabbed my CB microphone with shaking hands. "I see it," I said. "I see the truck. I am sorry. I am so sorry for what happened. I did not know. I swear I did not know." The voice came back immediately, no longer whispering but speaking in a normal, conversational tone that was somehow more frightening than the whispers had been. "You did not know because you did not care to know, Wade. You did not stop. You did not check. You just kept driving with your delivery schedule and your profit margin and your clean driving record. Jonas died alone in the dark and the rain, and you were probably having coffee at a truck stop by the time they found his body." Lightning flashed, turning the world white for a split second, and in that moment of brilliant illumination, I saw something that made my heart stop. There was someone standing on the shoulder of the road ahead of me. A figure in the rain, illuminated for just that instant by the lightning. I caught a glimpse of an old flannel shirt, work jeans, boots caked with mud, and a face that was pale and wrong, skin mottled with the purple and green of old bruises, or worse. The lightning faded, and the figure disappeared back into the darkness, but I knew it had been there. I knew what I had seen, or who I had seen. The voice on the radio spoke again, and this time it was right in my cab, surrounding me, filling every corner of the space with its presence. "Keep driving, Wade. We are not done yet. The night is still young, and you've got a lot of miles to cover before you understand. A lot of miles in the rain and the dark, just like Jonas had to crawl after the crash. He tried to climb back up to the road, did you know that? Tried to drag himself up that muddy embankment with both legs broken and his insides torn up from the steering wheel. He almost made it too. Got within maybe 10 feet of the highway before he could not go any farther. Laid there in the rain calling for help, but nobody stopped. Nobody even saw him down there in the dark." I realized I was crying, tears mixing with the sweat on my face. My hands were locked on the steering wheel, and my foot stayed on the accelerator even though every instinct was screaming at me to stop, to pull over, to get out of the truck and run. But I kept driving south on Highway 71 through the rain and the darkness, because something told me that stopping would be worse than continuing. That whatever was happening tonight would not let me escape by simply pulling over and waiting it out. The mile markers continued their slow countdown. 60, 65, 70. The storm raged around me, and the voice on the radio fell silent again, but I could feel it out there, watching me, waiting for something. At mile marker 72, my headlights caught something else on the shoulder. It was a shoe, just a single work boot lying in the grass at the edge of the pavement. As I passed it, the voice came back. "That is where Jonas lost his boot trying to climb out of the ravine. Size 10, brown leather, worn down at the heel from years of working construction jobs. His right foot was mostly gone by the time they found him, Wade. Animals got to him before the search party did." I did not respond. There was nothing I could say that would make any difference. I just kept driving, kept watching the road ahead, kept waiting for whatever was coming next. At mile marker 76, there was a shirt hanging from a tree branch, tattered and stained. At mile marker 80, there was a belt coiled in the grass like a snake. At mile marker 83, there was something dark and organic looking that I did not let myself identify, just caught a glimpse of it in my peripheral vision and forced myself not to look closer. The voice spoke after each one, describing what Jonas had lost, what he had left behind as he tried to crawl back to safety. The boot, the shirt, the belt, pieces of himself scattered along this dark highway, marking a trail that nobody had followed until it was too late. And I understood then what was happening. This was not just about making me feel guilty. This was not just about confession or apology. This was about showing me Jonas Lyle's last hours, step by step, mile by mile, making me drive through his death the way he had lived it. The voice wanted me to experience what Jonas had experienced, to understand the terrible slow progression from accident victim to dying man to corpse lying in the rain. My CB crackled, and the voice came back one more time. One more stop, Wade. One more mile marker. Then you will understand everything. I looked at my odometer and saw that I was approaching mile marker 90. The rain was falling harder than ever, and my windshield wipers could barely keep up with it. Through the downpour, I could see something ahead, something large blocking the right lane of the highway. As I got closer, my headlights revealed what it was, and I felt my blood turn to ice in my veins. It was a semi-truck, a blue Peterbilt, just like mine, pulled over at an angle across the shoulder and part of the right lane. The driver's side door was hanging open, and I could see someone slumped over the steering wheel inside the cab. The voice spoke one last time, and I realized with a shock that cut through everything else that I finally recognized it. It was my own voice, my own accent and inflection, speaking to me from the radio. This is where your story ends, Wade. This is mile marker 90, same place Jonas died 5 years ago tonight. Same rain, same darkness, same highway. You have been driving in circles for the past 3 hours, Wade. Going over the same stretch of road again and again, seeing the pieces of Jonas that got left behind. Now it is your turn to leave pieces behind. Your turn to crawl and call for help that will not come. Your turn to die alone in the rain. I looked at the speedometer and saw that I was still moving at 45 miles per hour, but the truck ahead was not getting any closer. I pressed harder on the accelerator and my speed increased to 50, then 55, but the distance stayed the same. The truck ahead remained exactly where it was, hanging in the rain-soaked darkness like a photograph, like a promise, like a preview of what was waiting for me at the end of this night. The voice faded then, dissolving back into static, and I was alone with just the rain and the darkness and the terrible knowledge of what I had done 5 years ago and what was about to happen to me now. The road stretched out ahead, the mile markers repeating endlessly, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would never reach Texarkana, would never make my delivery, would never see the sun rise again. I was going to die on Highway 71 in the rain and the darkness, just like Jonas Lyle had died, and maybe that was justice after all. The truck ahead of me remained frozen in the rain like a photograph that refused to develop any further. My foot stayed pressed against the accelerator, the engine roaring as my speedometer climbed past 60, but the blue Peterbilt blocking the road never got closer and never got farther away. It simply existed there in the cone of my headlights, door hanging open, figure slumped over the wheel, waiting for me to arrive at a destination I could never quite reach. I knew with a certainty that went deeper than logic that the figure in that cab was me, or would be me, or had already been me in some timeline that was bleeding through into this rain-soaked present. The voice on the radio had gone silent, but I could still feel its presence in the static, watching and waiting to see what I would do next. I tried downshifting, tried standing on the brakes, tried anything to break this spell of perpetual approach. The truck slowed under my efforts, the speedometer needle dropping from 60 to 50 to 40, but the distance to the Peterbilt ahead remained exactly the same. It was like trying to walk toward the horizon, every step covering ground that immediately replaced itself with more distance. My hands were shaking on the wheel now, and sweat was running down my face despite the cold air blasting from my vents. I reached for my CB radio again, desperate to hear any voice, even that terrible echo of my own that had been tormenting me. I cycled through the channels, listening to nothing but static on 19, on 17, on every frequency I could find. The storm had isolated me completely, cutting me off from the world of other drivers and distant truck stops, and the normal rhythms of life on the highway. I was alone in a bubble of rain and darkness with only the ghost of Jonas Lyle and the echo of my own guilt for company. Then something changed. The rain, which had been falling in solid sheets for what felt like hours, suddenly lessened, not stopping completely but pulling back to a steady downpour instead of the apocalyptic deluge I had been driving through. With the rain easing, my visibility improved, and I could see more details of the landscape around me. We were no longer in the forested hills I remembered from earlier in the drive. The trees had given way to more open country, fields stretching away into darkness on both sides of the highway. I caught glimpses of old barns and farmhouses in the lightning flashes, structures that looked abandoned and wrong, their roof lines sagging and their windows dark as empty eye sockets. This was not the Arkansas I knew, not the landscape I had driven through 1,000 times before. This was somewhere else, somewhere that existed alongside the real world but separate from it, a place where the rain never stopped and the guilty came to pay their debts. The truck ahead finally began to change position, not getting closer, but shifting somehow, rotating slowly until it was facing me head-on instead of angled across the lane. I could see the headlights now, 2 circles of yellow light that looked dim and sickly in the downpour. The figure in the cab was sitting upright now instead of slumped over the wheel, and though I could not make out any details through the rain-streaked windshield, I knew it was watching me, waiting for me. The voice came back on the radio, my own voice but twisted somehow, aged and weathered like it had been speaking from the bottom of a ravine for 5 years. You cannot outrun this, Wade. You cannot drive fast enough or far enough to escape what you did. Jonas waited 5 years for this night, 5 years in the dark and the rain, and now it is time for you to join him, time for you to understand what it means to be forgotten, to be left behind, to die alone while people drive past without stopping. I wanted to scream at the voice, to tell it that I was sorry, that I had not known, that I would have stopped if I had understood what happened. But the words caught in my throat because they were lies, and we both knew it. I had known something was wrong that night. I had seen the truck swerve and drift toward the shoulder. I had felt the slight bump that might have been my air pressure wave hitting the pickup's rear quarter panel. I had known, and I had chosen to keep driving because stopping would have been inconvenient, because it would have complicated my life, because it was easier to believe that everything was fine than to face the possibility that I had caused someone harm. That was the real sin, not the accident itself, but the choice I made afterward. The choice to not care, to not check, to not be responsible for another human being's suffering. The truck ahead suddenly accelerated, its headlights brightening as it came straight at me. There was no time to react, no time to swerve or brake or do anything except watch it coming. I threw up my arms instinctively, bracing for an impact that would crumple my cab like aluminum foil and end whatever strange loop I had been trapped in. But the collision never came. The other truck passed through mine like smoke, like a projection, like something that existed in a different layer of reality. I felt a wave of cold wash over me as it passed. Cold that went deeper than the air conditioning could account for. Cold that settled into my bones and my blood, and in that moment of passing I saw the driver's face pressed against the window. It was my face, but older, haggard, eyes sunken deep into their sockets, and skin the color of old newspaper. The mouth was open in a silent scream, and I understood that this was what I would become if I did not find a way out of this night. This was the Wade Collier who had died on Highway 71, who had crashed or been forced off the road or simply driven until his heart gave out from fear and guilt. This was my future staring back at me from the rain and the darkness. I watched in my mirrors as the ghost truck receded behind me, its taillights fading into the storm. When I looked forward again, the road had changed. I was no longer on Highway 71, or at least not any version of it that existed on normal maps. The pavement had deteriorated, cracked, and potholed, with grass growing up through the breaks in the asphalt. The road markings were faded to the point of invisibility, and the mile markers had been replaced by old wooden posts that I could not read in the darkness. The rain continued its steady drumming, and my wipers scraped across the windshield with a rhythm that was starting to sound like words. Jonas Lyle, Jonas Lyle, Jonas Lyle, over and over, until I wanted to rip the wiper motor out with my bare hands. I reached down and switched them off, preferring to drive nearly blind rather than listen to that accusing rhythm any longer. Without the wipers, the rain quickly obscured my windshield, and I had to lean forward and peer through the small clear space at the bottom of the glass. That was when I saw the figure standing in the road ahead. It was a man, or had been a man, standing perfectly still in the center of the northbound lane. He was wearing the same flannel shirt and work jeans I had glimpsed in the lightning flash earlier, but now I could see his face clearly despite the rain and darkness. It was a face that had spent too long in the weather, skin mottled and loose, eyes that did not reflect my headlights the way living eyes should. One arm hung at an unnatural angle, and when he took a step toward me, his right leg dragged behind him like it was no longer properly attached to his hip. I knew this was Jonas Lyle, or what was left of him after 5 years in the dark hollow below Highway 71. I knew I should stop, should get out and face him, should accept whatever punishment he had waiting for me. But the animal part of my brain, the part concerned only with survival, made the decision for me. I jerked the steering wheel hard to the left, aiming for the southbound lane to go around him. The truck responded sluggishly on the wet pavement, the trailer beginning to swing wide as I fought to control the turn. Jonas did not move from the center of the northbound lane, just stood there watching me with those dead eyes as I tried to swerve around him. For a moment, I thought I was going to make it, thought I would get past him and back onto whatever passed for the main highway in this nightmare version of Arkansas. Then I felt the trailer start to jackknife. I had been going too fast for the conditions, had turned too hard, had done exactly what Jonas had done that night when I came up behind him with my horn blaring. The trailer swung out to the right, pushing the back end of my cab with it, and suddenly I was sliding sideways across the wet pavement with absolutely no control over my vehicle. Everything happened in slow motion, the way they say it does in moments of crisis. I saw the right shoulder of the road coming up fast, saw the grass and the darkness beyond where the embankment dropped away into nothing. I stood on the brakes, but that only made the skid worse, the trailer pushing the cab even harder. Jonas was still standing in the road as I slid past him, and I swear I saw him smile. A terrible expression on that ruined face. Then the shoulder was under my wheels, and I felt the terrible floating sensation of going over the edge. The cab tilted, passenger side dropping first, and I was thrown against my door as the whole rig began to roll. I remember thinking that this was it, that I was finally going to experience what Jonas had experienced. The crash and the impact and the terrible knowledge that you are going to die, and there's nothing you can do about it. I remember the sound of metal grinding and glass breaking. I remember the sudden stop that threw me against my seatbelt so hard I thought my ribs would cave in. And then I remember nothing at all, just darkness and silence, and the distant sound of rain falling. When I woke up, I was not in my truck anymore. I was lying on wet grass, rain falling on my face, and every part of my body was screaming with pain. I tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as fire shot through my ribs and my left arm refused to cooperate. I managed to roll onto my right side and look around, trying to figure out where I was and what had happened. My truck was about 20 feet away, lying on its passenger side at the bottom of an embankment. The trailer had separated from the cab and was resting at an angle against a stand of trees. Steam or smoke was rising from the engine compartment, and I could smell diesel fuel and hot metal. I had gone over the side just like Jonas had gone over, had rolled and crashed just like he had rolled and crashed. But I was alive, conscious, able to move even if it hurt like hell. Jonas had not been so lucky. I tried to call out for help, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. My throat was raw, and I could taste blood in my mouth. I looked up at the highway above me, saw the lights of a vehicle passing by, and tried to wave my good arm. But the vehicle did not stop, did not even slow down. Just kept moving through the rain, the driver probably never seeing me down here in the darkness. I understood then what Jonas had gone through. The crash itself was terrible, but the aftermath was worse. The knowledge that you need help, that you are hurt badly, that you might be dying, but no one stops. No one sees you. No one cares. You are just another piece of debris that fell off the highway, something to be found later by a maintenance crew or a search party if you are found at all. I tried to crawl toward the embankment, thinking maybe I could climb up to the road, maybe flag down a driver who would actually stop and help me. But my left arm was useless, probably broken, and my left leg was not much better. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through my body, and after maybe 10 feet of dragging myself through the wet grass, I had to stop and rest. The rain continued falling, soaking through my clothes and chilling me to the bone. I could feel myself starting to shake, the first stages of shock setting in, and I knew I needed to get help soon or I was going to die down here just like Jonas had died. I looked back at my truck and saw something that made my blood run cold despite the shock and the pain. There was someone standing next to the cab, a figure in a flannel shirt and work jeans looking down at me with those dead eyes. Jonas Lyle had followed me over the edge. He started walking toward me, that terrible dragging limp, and I tried to crawl faster even though I knew it was useless. I could not outrun him, could not escape him, could not do anything except wait for him to reach me and do whatever he had been planning to do since this nightmare began. But as he got closer, I realized something. He was not coming to hurt me. He was coming to help me, or at least to show me something. Jonas stopped about 5 feet away and looked up at the highway. I followed his gaze and saw another set of headlights approaching, a big rig moving south through the rain. Jonas turned back to me and spoke, his voice wet and thick, like he was talking through water. "Call out, Wade. Try to stop them. See if they care enough to check." I tried. God help me, I tried. I waved my good arm and shouted as loud as I could, though the sound that came out was more of a croak than a shout. The truck passed overhead without slowing, the sound of its engine dopplering away into the distance. Jonas nodded slowly, like I had just confirmed something he already knew. "Now you understand," he said. "Now you know what it feels like to be abandoned, to be left for dead, while people drive past worrying about their schedules and their deliveries and anything except the possibility that someone might need their help." More vehicles passed, a car, another truck, an SUV with its high beams on. I called out to all of them, waved, tried everything I could to get their attention. But no one stopped. No one even slowed down to look. I was invisible down here in the dark and the rain, just another accident that someone else would have to deal with. Just another problem that could be ignored if you drove fast enough. After the 5th or 6th vehicle passed without stopping, I stopped trying. I just lay there in the wet grass with the rain falling on me and Jonas Lyle standing watch a few feet away, and I understood that this was my punishment. Not death, though that might come eventually. The real punishment was understanding, was experiencing firsthand the terrible loneliness and abandonment that comes from being forgotten by the world. Jonas spoke again, his voice somehow clear despite the rain and the wind. I waited 3 days for someone to find me, Wade. 3 days down in that ravine with both legs broken and my insides torn up. 3 days listening to vehicles pass overhead while I slowly bled out and went cold. I called out until my voice gave out. I waved until I could not lift my arms anymore. And then I just lay there and waited to die. You gave me 15 minutes before you stopped trying. Before you gave up and accepted that no one was coming. 15 minutes, Wade. I tried to tell him I was sorry, tried to explain that I had not known, but the words would not come. My voice was gone, shock was setting in deeper, and the cold was spreading through my body like ice water in my veins. I could feel myself slipping away, consciousness fading at the edges, and I knew that if I passed out down here, I might never wake up. Jonas seemed to sense what was happening. He knelt down next to me, his ruined face close to mine, and I could smell the earth and rot that clung to him. This is your choice now, Wade. You can die down here, like I died, slow and cold and alone. Or you can fight, you can crawl up that embankment the way I tried to crawl up mine. You can drag yourself back to the road and try again to flag down help. Maybe someone will stop this time. Maybe someone will care enough to check. Or maybe you will make it 10 feet up that slope and realize you cannot go any farther, and you will slide back down and lie here until the cold takes you. Either way, you will understand what I went through. You will carry that knowledge for whatever time you have left. He stood up and backed away, fading into the rain and darkness like he had never been there at all. And I was alone again, with just the pain and the cold and the sound of the rain falling. I do not know how long I lay there before I made the decision to try. Time had stopped meaning anything, each moment stretching out into eternity and then compressing back into nothing. But eventually, some spark of survival instinct or stubbornness or maybe just fear of dying like this made me start moving. I rolled onto my stomach and began dragging myself toward the embankment, using my right arm and my good leg to pull myself forward inches at a time. The grass was slick with rain and my own blood, and I kept sliding backward, losing ground, having to start over. But I kept going because the alternative was to lie still and die, and I was not ready for that yet. The embankment seemed impossibly high, a cliff face that no injured man could hope to climb. But I got my hand on a root, pulled myself up a few feet, found a rock to brace my good leg against, pulled up a few more feet. The pain was incredible. White, hot flashes that made me see stars, but I pushed through it and kept climbing. I made it maybe 15 feet up the 30-foot slope before I could not go any farther. My strength was gone, my good arm shaking with exhaustion, my leg cramping so badly I could not get any purchase on the muddy surface. I clung to a small tree growing out of the slope and looked up at the road above me, so close but impossibly far away. I could see the edge of the pavement, could see the white fog line marking the shoulder. I was closer than Jonas had gotten, I realized. He had said he made it within 10 feet of the road before he had to stop. I had made it within 15 feet. But it did not matter because I could not go any farther and the cold was spreading through my limbs, and I could feel my grip on the tree starting to loosen. That was when I saw the headlights coming. Not passing overhead this time, but slowing down, a vehicle pulling over onto the shoulder right above where I was clinging to the embankment. A door opened, and I heard a voice calling out, a woman's voice rough with age and cigarettes. "Hello, is someone down there? I saw something on the shoulder. Thought maybe there was an accident. I tried to call back, but my voice was too weak. I tried to wave, but I could not let go of the tree without sliding back down. So I just hung there and hoped she would look over the edge. Hoped she would care enough to check. Hoped that this time someone would stop. Footsteps in the gravel above, coming closer to the edge. Then a flashlight beam swept down the embankment and found me clinging to the tree like a broken spider. The woman let out a curse and called out to someone else, probably a passenger in her vehicle. "There is someone down here. Call 911. Tell them we have got an injured person off Highway 71 near mile marker 90. Tell them to hurry." I heard her voice, but I could not hold on anymore. My hand slipped off the tree and I started sliding back down the embankment, tumbling and rolling, fresh pain exploding through my body with each impact. I came to rest at the bottom where I had started, lying on my back in the wet grass, looking up at the dark sky and the rain falling down. But this time, there was a light up above, a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and voices calling down to me. Someone had stopped. Someone had cared enough to check. Someone was coming to help. Everything started to fade then, the edges of my vision going dark, sounds becoming muffled and distant. I heard sirens somewhere far away, heard more voices, felt hands touching me and lifting me, but it all seemed to be happening to someone else, like I was watching from a distance. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me completely was Jonas Lyle standing at the edge of the clearing, rain falling through his translucent form. He was not smiling anymore. He just looked sad and tired, like someone who had carried a burden for too long and was finally able to set it down. He raised one hand in what might have been a wave or a farewell, and then he was gone, dissolved into the rain and the darkness like he had never been there at all. I woke up in a hospital room with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the smell of disinfectant burning in my nostrils. For a moment, I could not remember where I was or how I had gotten there, could only register the dull ache that seemed to radiate from every part of my body. Then it all came flooding back in a rush that made my heart rate spike on the monitor next to my bed. The rain, the voice on the CB radio, Jonas Lyle standing in the road, the crash in the cold, wet grass and the terrible crawl up the embankment. I tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as pain shot through my ribs. A nurse appeared at my bedside almost instantly, gently pushing me back down onto the pillows and adjusting something on the IV line running into my arm. "Easy there, Mr. Collier," she said in a voice that was professionally soothing but carried an edge of genuine concern. "You have been through quite an ordeal. You need to rest and let your body heal." I asked her where I was and how long I had been unconscious, my voice coming out as a harsh croak that barely sounded like me. She told me I was at Crawford Memorial Hospital in Van Buren, that I had been brought in by ambulance 3 days ago with multiple injuries including 2 broken ribs, a fractured left arm, severe bruising, and hypothermia. 3 days. I had lost 3 entire days to unconsciousness and medication. 3 days during which I could have been anywhere or anyone. The nurse saw the confusion on my face and explained that they had kept me heavily sedated while my body stabilized, that the hypothermia had been particularly concerning, and they had needed to bring my core temperature back up slowly to avoid complications. She told me I was lucky to be alive, that if that woman had not stopped when she did, I probably would have died from exposure before morning. I asked her about the woman who had found me, wanted to know her name so I could thank her, but the nurse said she had not left any contact information. Just called 911, waited until the ambulance arrived, and then drove off into the night. An anonymous Good Samaritan who had cared enough to stop and check when she saw something wrong on the side of the highway. The police came to interview me later that afternoon. A state trooper named Officer Garrett, who looked too young to be wearing the uniform but had eyes that had seen more than his age suggested. He asked me what I remembered about the accident, and I told him the truth as I remembered it, though I left out the parts about ghost voices on the CB radio and dead men standing in the road. I told him I had been driving through the storm, that visibility was poor, that I must have lost control on the wet pavement and gone over the embankment. It happened sometimes to even experienced drivers in bad weather. He wrote it all down in his notebook, his pen scratching across the paper with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet hospital room. Then he asked me something that made my blood run cold. He asked me if I had ever heard the name Jonas Lyle. I must have reacted to the name because Officer Garrett leaned forward slightly, his young face suddenly very serious. He told me that Jonas Lyle had died on Highway 71 about 5 years ago. Single vehicle accident on a rainy night. Went over an embankment near mile marker 90 and was not found for several days. The investigation had never been able to determine exactly what caused the accident, but witnesses reported seeing a semi-truck in the area around the time of the crash. A blue Peterbilt, according to one farmer who had been driving home from town that night. The witness had not gotten a license plate number, had just remembered the color and the company name on the trailer. Razor Ridge Transport. My company. My truck. My route. I opened my mouth to tell Officer Garrett everything, to confess what I had done or failed to do that night 5 years ago, to finally unburden myself of the guilt that had apparently been eating at me from somewhere deep below consciousness. But before I could speak, he held up his hand and told me something else. He said that Jonas Lyle's brother had been looking into the accident for years, trying to find out what really happened, trying to track down the truck driver who might have been involved. The brother's name was Silas Lyle, and he had become somewhat obsessed with finding answers, had spent thousands of dollars hiring private investigators and tracking down leads. About 2 years ago, Silas had started monitoring CB radio frequencies along Highway 71, listening for truckers who ran regular routes through that area, trying to identify anyone who might have information about his brother's death. Officer Garrett said that several truckers had reported being harassed by someone using a CB radio to make threats and accusations, someone who seemed to know intimate details about their routes and schedules. The harassment had escalated over time, becoming more aggressive and more disturbing, until about 6 months ago when it suddenly stopped. They found Silas Lyle's body in a motel room in Mena, dead from an apparent suicide. On the table next to him was a CB radio and a notebook filled with information about various truck drivers, their routes, their schedules, their personal details. My name was in that notebook, highlighted and underlined multiple times. Officer Garrett told me all of this in a flat, professional tone, watching my face for reactions. He said they believed Silas had been using the CB radio to harass drivers he suspected of being involved in his brother's death, that the voice I heard on the radio that night was probably recordings Silas had made before he died, played back through some kind of automated system he had set up. The technology existed to do something like that, the officer explained, to program a CB radio to broadcast on specific channels at specific times, to create the illusion of someone actively communicating when really it was just a dead man's voice reaching out from the grave. It was a neat explanation, logical and rational, something that fit comfortably into the world of police reports and evidence and reasonable doubt. But I knew the truth. I had seen Jonas Lyle standing in the road with rain falling through his translucent form. I had felt the cold that came off him like radiation from ice. I had heard him speak with a voice that came from somewhere deeper than any recording could reach. What I had experienced out there on Highway 71 was not technology or automation or the clever machinations of a grief-crazed brother. It was something older and more terrible than that, something that the official world of police and hospitals could not accommodate in its understanding of how reality worked. Officer Garrett asked me if I wanted to press charges against Silas Lyle's estate for the harassment, if I wanted to pursue any kind of legal action for the distress the CB radio messages had caused. I told him no, that I just wanted to put the whole thing behind me and focus on recovering from my injuries. He seemed satisfied with that answer, told me he would file his report as a weather-related accident with no criminal component, and that I should contact him if I remembered any additional details that might be relevant. After he left, I lay in my hospital bed and stared at the ceiling tiles, trying to process everything he had told me. The official story made sense on the surface, but it could not explain what I had experienced. It could not explain the physical evidence I had seen scattered along the highway, the boot and the shirt and the other things. It could not explain how the truck ahead of me had passed through my cab like smoke, or how I had been trapped in a loop driving the same stretch of road over and over. Most of all, it could not explain the look in Jonas Lyle's eyes when he stood next to me at the bottom of that embankment, the sadness and the understanding, and the release that came when someone finally stopped to help me the way no one had stopped to help him. I spent another week in the hospital before they released me, my ribs taped and my arm in a cast, and a bottle of pain medication that I was determined not to become dependent on. My truck had been totaled in the crash, the cab too damaged to be worth repairing, and the trailer a complete loss. The cargo of agricultural equipment had been scattered across the bottom of the ravine, and my company's insurance was still fighting with the manufacturer over who was responsible for the loss. I had lost my truck, my livelihood, and nearly my life, all because I had made a choice 5 years ago to keep driving instead of stopping to check on another human being. Razor Ridge Transport put me on paid leave while I recovered, which was generous of them considering the circumstances, but I knew I would not be going back to driving for them or anyone else. The road had shown me something about myself that night, something I could not unsee or unknow, and I was not ready to face it again behind the wheel of another truck. Instead, I decided to do what I should have done 5 years ago. I decided to find out the truth about Jonas Lyle and what had happened to him that night on Highway 71. The Crawford County Library had back issues of the local newspaper on microfiche, and I spent several days scrolling through editions from 5 years ago until I found the articles about Jonas. There was a small piece when he was first reported missing, just a few paragraphs noting that a local man had failed to return home from a construction job and that searchers were looking for him. Then, nothing for 3 days until the follow-up article that reported the discovery of his body. The details matched what Jonas's ghost had told me at the bottom of the embankment. He had been found in a ravine off Highway 71 near mile marker 90, dead from injuries sustained in a single-vehicle accident that investigators believed had occurred several days earlier. The medical examiner had determined that Jonas had survived the initial crash, but died from his injuries and exposure while waiting for help that never came. He had crawled partway up the embankment before his body gave out. The article mentioned that he was survived by a younger brother, Silas, and that the family was requesting privacy during their time of grief. There were follow-up articles over the next few weeks as the investigation continued, but they never came to any definitive conclusion about what had caused the accident. No mechanical failure was found in Jonas's truck. No evidence of alcohol or drugs in his system. No obvious explanation for why an experienced driver would lose control on a road he had driven hundreds of times before. The case was eventually ruled an accident and closed, leaving Silas Lyle with no answers and no justice, and an obsession that would eventually consume him. I found information about Silas's death in more recent newspapers. The articles were brief and matter-of-fact, noting that he had been found dead in a motel room from what appeared to be a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Police said there was no evidence of foul play, and no note was found, but family members reported that Silas had been struggling with depression related to his brother's death. The investigation into several CB radio harassment incidents was mentioned in passing, but the articles made it clear that the police considered the matter closed with Silas's death. No charges would be filed, no further action would be taken. Silas Lyle, in his grief and his desperate need for answers, had been filed away into the closed case drawers of the state police office. Another sad story with no resolution. But I knew there was more to it than that. Silas might have started the harassment, might have been the one monitoring CB frequencies and gathering information about truck drivers who used Highway 71. But what I had experienced out there in the rain went beyond anything Silas could have engineered with technology and recordings. Jonas Lyle himself had been there, or something that wore his face and carried his memories and his anger. The dead had reached across the barrier between worlds to make me understand what I had done, and no police report or rational explanation could change that fact. I drove out to mile marker 90 on a clear afternoon 2 weeks after I was released from the hospital. I had rented a car since I no longer had my truck, and the drive south from Van Buren felt strange and unfamiliar without the height and the rumble of a big rig around me. The highway looked different in daylight, ordinary and unremarkable. Just another stretch of 2-lane blacktop winding through the Arkansas hills. I found the place where I'd gone over the embankment, the broken guardrail still not repaired, orange traffic cones marking the spot where my truck had crashed through. I parked on the shoulder and walked to the edge, looking down into the ravine where my Peterbilt still lay on its side among the trees. No one had bothered to recover it yet, and it sat there rusting and forgotten, a monument to my failure and my fear. I walked along the shoulder for about a quarter mile in each direction, looking for the things I had seen that night. The boot, the shirt, the belt, all the pieces of Jonas Lyle that had marked his trail. But there was nothing there, just grass and gravel and the occasional piece of roadside trash. Either those items had been cleaned up years ago by maintenance crews, or they had never been there at all, except in whatever shared nightmare Jonas and I had inhabited that night. About 100 yards north of where my truck went over, I found what I was looking for. There was a gap in the tree line where the brush was thinner, and when I made my way down the slope, I found the remnants of an old dirt road that had been there long before the highway was built. Following it deeper into the ravine, I came to a place where the ground was disturbed, where someone had dug into the hillside and then filled it back in. There was no marker, no sign, nothing to indicate what this spot was or why it mattered. But I knew. This was where they had found Jonas Lyle after 3 days, where he had died alone in the dark with his broken body and his fading hope that someone would care enough to look for him. I stood there for a long time, looking at that unremarkable patch of ground, trying to think of something meaningful to say, but what words could possibly be adequate? I was sorry, but sorry was not enough. I had not meant for it to happen, but intent did not change the outcome. I would carry his memory with me for the rest of my life. But memory was cold comfort to a man who had died cold and alone because I had not stopped to check on him. Finally, I just said his name. Jonas Lyle. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, and I felt that same cold presence I'd felt the night of the accident. That sense of something watching and listening from just beyond the edge of perception. But this time there was no anger in it, no accusation or demand for punishment. Just a profound sadness and a kind of acknowledgement, like we had finally reached an understanding about what had happened between us. I left flowers at the spot, nothing elaborate, just some wildflowers I picked from the side of the highway. Then I climbed back up to the road and stood at the edge looking down, imagining Jonas making that same terrible climb with his broken legs and his failing strength, getting within 10 feet of help before his body gave out. I thought about the woman who had stopped for me, who had seen something wrong and cared enough to check, who had saved my life through that simple act of human decency. I thought about how different things might have been if someone like her had been driving past when Jonas needed help. If just one person had stopped and looked over the edge of the embankment and seen him lying there in the dark. But no one had stopped, and Jonas had died, and I had kept driving that night with my schedule and my profit margin and my willful blindness to the possibility that I had caused another person harm. That is the weight I carry now, heavier than any load I ever hauled in my truck. I sold my truck driving gear and found work at a warehouse in Little Rock, indoor work with regular hours and no long nights on the highway. I avoid Highway 71 completely, taking alternate routes that add time and distance to any trip, but keep me away from that stretch of road between Fort Smith and Texarkana. I have not touched a CB radio since that night, have not listened to the chatter of drivers calling out mile markers and weather conditions and warnings about speed traps. That world is behind me now, left on the side of a rain-soaked highway, along with the driver I used to be. Sometimes I think about Silas Lyle and the obsession that consumed him, the need to find answers and assign blame, and make someone pay for his brother's death. I understand that need now in a way I could not have before. I understand the rage that comes from watching someone you love be forgotten, be reduced to a case file and a sad story and a statistic about highway fatalities. Silas never got his answers before he died, never got the satisfaction of confronting the driver who had contributed to Jonas's accident. But maybe in some way I gave him what he was looking for that night on Highway 71. Maybe forcing me to experience what Jonas experienced, to understand the terrible loneliness and abandonment of being left to die on the side of the road, was the justice Silas had been seeking all along. I drive past the library sometimes and see people going in to research their family histories or check out books or use the computers. Normal people doing normal things, living lives that do not include ghosts and guilt, and the knowledge that you can kill someone through inaction as surely as through violence. I envy them their innocence, their ability to move through the world without carrying the weight of the dead on their shoulders. But I also know that any one of them could make the same choice I made, could drive past an accident scene, or ignore a call for help or convince themselves that someone else will handle it because stopping would be inconvenient. We are all one bad decision away from creating our own Jonas Lyles, our own ghosts that will follow us through the rain and the darkness, demanding that we understand what we have done. The only difference between me and them is that I have already made that choice, and I have already paid the price for it in blood and pain and the loss of everything I thought I knew about myself. I carry Jonas Lyle with me now wherever I go, a presence just at the edge of my awareness, a reminder of the man I let die and the debt I can never fully repay. Sometimes, on rainy nights, I think I hear his voice on the wind, not accusing or angry anymore, but just there, bearing witness to what happened on Highway 71 and to the choices we all make when we think no one is watching. 6 months passed before I had the courage to drive Highway 71 again. Not in a truck this time, just the same rental car I'd been using since the accident, the one that felt too small and too quiet after years of riding high in a Peterbilt cab. I told myself I was making the drive to visit an old friend in Texarkana, but that was a lie I constructed to make the trip seem reasonable and normal. The truth was that I needed to go back, needed to face that stretch of road one more time in daylight and good weather, needed to prove to myself that it was just asphalt and paint and mile markers like any other highway in America. I needed to know that Jonas Lyle was truly gone, that his ghost had found whatever peace it was looking for when it watched me get rescued from the bottom of that embankment. The journey that had nearly killed me 6 months ago took on a different character in the bright May sunshine, with wildflowers blooming along the shoulders and the Ozark Hills green and alive with spring growth. I left Little Rock just after dawn, taking Highway 40 west to Fort Smith, and then turning south onto Highway 71. The morning was cool and clear, the kind of weather that makes you understand why people fall in love with Arkansas despite its poverty and its problems and its complicated history. I had the windows down and the radio playing country music, trying to maintain a casual attitude about what I was doing, trying to pretend this was just another drive through familiar territory. But my hands were tight on the steering wheel, and I could feel my heart rate increasing as I passed through Waldron and continued south into the hills. Every mile marker I passed felt like a countdown, a progression toward some inevitable confrontation that I both dreaded and needed. The road looked harmless in the daylight, winding through the forested hills with occasional glimpses of farmhouses and cleared fields. There were other vehicles on the highway now, a mix of cars and trucks going about their normal business, and that made it easier somehow. I was not alone out here, not isolated in a bubble of rain and darkness with only ghosts for company. I was just another driver on a busy highway, someone who had every right to be here and nothing to fear from the pavement beneath my wheels. As I approached mile marker 90, I found myself slowing down without consciously deciding to do so. The broken guardrail where my truck had gone over had been repaired, replaced with new galvanized steel that gleamed in the sunlight. The orange traffic cones were gone, and there was nothing to indicate that anything unusual had ever happened at this spot. Just another random point along the highway, indistinguishable from the miles that came before it and the miles that would come after. I pulled onto the shoulder about 100 yards past the marker and sat there with the engine running, looking back at the place where my life had changed forever. Part of me wanted to drive on, to continue south to Texarkana and complete the fiction I had constructed about visiting a friend, but I knew I had not come all this way just to drive past without stopping. I shut off the engine and got out of the car, the warm spring air a shocking contrast to the cold rain I remembered from that night. Birds were singing in the trees, and I could hear the distant sound of a tractor working in some nearby field. Life continuing its normal rhythms, indifferent to the human dramas that played out along this ribbon of asphalt. I walked back to mile marker 90 and stood at the repaired guardrail, looking down into the ravine where my truck had rolled. The vegetation had already begun to reclaim the damage, new growth covering the scars in the earth where the Peterbilt had torn through. I could still see the truck down there, or what was left of it. The cab now completely stripped of anything valuable by salvages, and the trailer reduced to a rust-colored skeleton. It looked small from up here, harmless, like a child's toy that had been abandoned and forgotten. I tried to feel something looking at it, tried to access the fear and the pain I had experienced during those terrible hours at the bottom of the ravine. But the emotions would not come, replaced by a kind of distant acknowledgement that yes, that had happened to me. But it had happened to a different version of Wade Collier, a man who no longer existed. The person I was now had been forged in that crucible of guilt and terror and physical suffering, and looking at the wreckage of my old truck felt like looking at a shed skin, something I had outgrown and left behind. I heard a vehicle approaching from the south and turned to see a semi-truck cresting the rise, its chrome grille glinting in the sunlight. For a moment, my heart seized in my chest as I waited to see if it would be a blue Peterbilt, if somehow the ghost truck from that rainy night had found its way back into the daylight world. But it was just a red Kenworth hauling a load of hay bales, the driver giving me a friendly wave as he passed. I waved back automatically, a gesture that felt strange after months away from the trucker community, and watched the truck disappear around the next curve. That was when I saw her standing on the opposite shoulder of the highway, an older woman in jeans and a denim jacket, gray hair pulled back in a ponytail, watching me with an expression I could not quite read. She looked familiar in a way that made my skin prickle, and it took me a moment to realize why. This was the woman who had stopped the night of the accident, The anonymous Good Samaritan who had looked over the embankment and seen me clinging to that tree. The woman who had called 911 and saved my life. I raised my hand in an uncertain greeting and started to cross the highway toward her, wanting to thank her, needing to tell her how much her simple act of caring had meant to me. But she held up her own hand to stop me, and I froze in the middle of the northbound lane. There was something about her stillness, about the way she stood there without moving, that made me suddenly uncertain about what I was seeing. She called out to me across the empty highway, her voice carrying clearly in the spring air. "You should not have come back here, Wade Collier. Some roads are better left behind." The use of my full name sent a chill down my spine despite the warm sunshine. I had never told her my name that night, had never spoken to her directly at all. I had been semi-conscious at the bottom of the ravine while she called for help from above. "Who are you?" I called back, though some part of me already knew the answer. "How do you know my name?" She smiled, a sad expression that did not reach her eyes. "I know a lot of things about you, Wade. I know what you did 5 years ago. I know about Jonas Lyle and how he died while you kept driving. I know about Silas and his obsession and his recordings and his death. I know everything because I was there for all of it." My mouth went dry and I took an involuntary step backward. "That is not possible. You stopped to help me 6 months ago. You called 911. The hospital told me about you." She shook her head slowly. "The hospital told you what their records showed, what the 911 dispatcher logged in the system. But records can be wrong, Wade. Memories can be unreliable. Did you ever wonder why that woman never left her name? Why she disappeared before the ambulance arrived? Why nobody could tell you anything about her except that she had called for help?" I wanted to argue, to insist that she was real because I had seen her, because the nurse had told me about her, because the alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. But the words would not come because she was right. I had never questioned the convenient appearance of my rescuer, had never wondered too deeply about the timing or the circumstances. I had simply accepted my salvation and moved on with my recovery, grateful to be alive and unwilling to examine the mechanism of my survival too closely. "If you were not really there that night," I said slowly, "then who called 911? How did the ambulance know where to find me?" The woman's smile deepened, becoming something almost fond. "Jonas called for you, Wade. Not on a phone or a radio, but in the way the dead can call when the living are finally ready to hear them. He could have left you there to die the way he died, could have watched you freeze and fade and slip away into nothing. That would have been justice of a kind, an eye for an eye, a death for a death. But Jonas was not that kind of man, not in life and not in death. He just wanted you to understand what you had done, to carry that knowledge with you for whatever time you had left. Once you understood, once you had experienced even a fraction of what he went through, he was done. He let you be found. He let you live. That was his gift to you, Wade. The gift of understanding and the burden of memory." I felt tears running down my face without realizing I had started crying. I wanted to say I was sorry. I wanted to make it right somehow. She nodded as if I had said something wise instead of something obvious and inadequate. "You cannot make it right, Wade. Some things that break cannot be fixed. But you can carry the weight of it, can let it change you, can become someone who stops and checks and cares about the suffering of strangers. That is all Jonas wanted from you. Not revenge or punishment, just acknowledgement and change." "Then who are you?" I asked again. "Why are you here?" The woman looked up at the clear blue sky, squinting slightly against the brightness of the sun. When she looked back at me, her face had changed somehow, become less distinct, like I was seeing her through fog even though the air was perfectly clear. I am what happens when the dead make allowances for the living. I am the shape that mercy takes when it crosses the boundary between worlds. I am the voice on the phone and the light in the darkness and the reason you are still breathing. Jonas could not save himself, but he could save you, and so I was what he needed me to be that night. A woman stopping to help. A stranger who cared. A bridge between your death and your survival. She started to fade then, her edges blurring and dissolving like smoke in a gentle breeze. I took a step toward her, reaching out as if I could somehow hold her here through force of will, could keep her solid and real for just a few more moments, but she was already gone, leaving only her voice hanging in the air like an echo. Drive carefully, Wade Collier. Honor the gift you were given. Stop when others need help. Be the person who looks over the edge when something seems wrong. That is how you repay the debt you owe to Jonas Lyle. Not through guilt or grief, but through changed behavior, through becoming someone better than you were. The highway was empty again. Just me standing on the shoulder with traffic passing by and the spring sunshine warm on my face. I looked around for any sign that the woman had been there, any evidence that I had not imagined the entire conversation. But there was nothing except a sense of completion, of a circle finally closing, of a debt acknowledged even if it could never be fully repaid. I walked back to my car and sat behind the wheel for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened and everything I had learned. The official story was that Silas Lyle had harassed me using CB radio technology, that I had crashed during a storm and been rescued by an anonymous woman, that my injuries and trauma had caused me to experience hallucinations and false memories. That story was neat and contained and fit comfortably within the boundaries of what the rational world could accept. But I knew the truth was something stranger and more terrifying and ultimately more merciful than the official story allowed. Jonas Lyle had reached across the barrier between life and death to teach me a lesson about responsibility and consequence. He had forced me to experience his suffering so that I would understand what my inaction had cost. And then, when I had learned that lesson, he had saved my life instead of taking it. That was the gift the woman had spoken of, the burden I would carry for the rest of my days. I started the car and pulled back onto Highway 71, continuing south toward Texarkana. But this time, I drove carefully, attentively, watching the shoulders and the oncoming traffic with an awareness I had never possessed before. Every vehicle that passed me was someone's husband or wife or parent or child, someone with a full life and people who loved them and dreams they had not yet fulfilled. Every curve in the road was a place where conditions could change in an instant, where control could be lost and lives could be shattered. The highway was not just a ribbon of asphalt connecting points on a map. It was a shared space where strangers put their trust in each other to be careful, to be alert, to care about the consequences of their actions. I understood that now in a way I never had before, and that understanding changed how I moved through the world. About 20 miles south of mile marker 90, I came around a curve and saw a vehicle pulled over on the shoulder ahead. It was an old pickup truck with its hood up and hazard lights flashing, steam rising from the engine compartment. A man in work clothes was standing next to it looking frustrated and worried, and I felt my foot moving toward the brake pedal before I had consciously decided to stop. This was not a setup or a trap or an attempt to lure me into danger. This was just someone who needed help, someone whose day had gone wrong, someone who would benefit from a stranger caring enough to stop and offer assistance. I pulled over behind the truck and got out, calling out to let the man know I was friendly and just wanted to help. He turned toward me with relief plain on his face, and I could see he was probably in his 50s, weathered and tired-looking, grateful that someone had stopped. "Radiator hose blew," he said, gesturing at the engine. "I have got a spare in the back, but I cannot get the clamp loose. My hands are not what they used to be." I told him I had some tools in my trunk and that we could probably get him back on the road within the hour. We worked together in the warm sunshine, me loosening the clamps and him guiding the new hose into place, two strangers cooperating to solve a simple problem. It was ordinary and unremarkable, the kind of small kindness that happens 1,000 times a day on highways across the country. But for me, it was everything. It was proof that I had learned the lesson Jonas Lyle had died to teach me. It was evidence that I had changed, that I had become someone who stopped and checked and cared about the welfare of others. The man thanked me profusely when we finished, tried to give me money that I refused, and drove off with a wave and a promise to pay the kindness forward. I stood on the shoulder and watched him go, his taillights disappearing around the next curve, and I felt something ease in my chest that had been tight since that rainy night 6 months ago. I could not bring Jonas Lyle back from the dead. I could not undo the choice I had made 5 years ago when I kept driving instead of stopping. But I could do this. I could be present and attentive and willing to help when help was needed. I could be the person who looked over the edge when something seemed wrong. I could stop every time, without exception, without hesitation, without the calculations about convenience and schedule that had guided my behavior before. That was how I would honor Jonas's memory and repay the debt I owed him. Not through guilt or self-flagellation, but through simple acts of human decency repeated over and over until they became second nature. I got back in my car and continued south, and for the first time since the accident I felt something approaching peace. The weight was still there, the knowledge of what I had done and what it had cost, but it no longer crushed me beneath its burden. I could carry it now, could integrate it into who I was becoming, could use it as fuel for better behavior rather than as an anchor dragging me down into despair. The highway stretched ahead through the spring landscape, and I drove it with the attention and care of someone who understood that every mile mattered, that every moment behind the wheel was an opportunity to choose between the person I had been and the person I wanted to become. The sun was setting by the time I reached Texarkana, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me of fire and transformation. I did not have a friend to visit there, did not have any real destination at all except the journey itself and the confrontation with my past that I had been avoiding for 6 months. But I had made the drive, had faced the road where Jonas died, and I nearly followed him, and I had survived it. More than survived it. I had learned something from it. I had been given a second chance that Jonas never got, and I was determined not to waste it on the same mistakes and the same willful blindness that had defined my first attempt at living. I found a motel on the edge of town and checked in for the night, too exhausted from the emotional weight of the day to drive back to Little Rock. I lay in bed watching the lights from the highway play across the ceiling and thought about all the drivers out there in the darkness, hauling their loads and fighting fatigue and making the same thousands of small choices that add up to either tragedy or safe arrival. I hoped they were being careful. I hoped they were paying attention. I hoped that if they saw something wrong, if they witnessed an accident or noticed a vehicle in distress, they would do what I failed to do 5 years ago. I hoped they would stop. The next morning, I drove back to Little Rock, taking the same route through the mountains and the river valleys, past the same mile markers and the same curve where Jonas Lyle lost control and went over the embankment. But this time, I was not running from anything, or hiding from my guilt, or trying to pretend the past had not happened. I was simply moving forward, carrying my burden with as much grace as I could muster, trying to be better than I had been. That is all any of us can do, really. Learn from our failures, change our behavior, stop when others need help, and carry the weight of our choices without letting it destroy us. The road goes on forever, winding through darkness and light, through rain and sunshine, through moments of crisis and moments of grace. We choose at every mile marker whether to keep driving or to stop and check. We choose whether to be the kind of person who cares about the suffering of strangers or the kind who finds it easier to look away. I made the wrong choice once, and it cost a man his life and nearly cost me my own. I will not make that choice again. I will stop every time. I will check every time. I will care every time. That is the promise I made to Jonas Lyle's ghost on a rain-soaked highway in Arkansas, and it is the promise I keep every day I am alive to keep it. The dead do not ask much of us, really, just that we remember them, that we learn from them, that we become better people because they existed. Jonas Lyle taught me more in death than most people teach in a lifetime of living, and I am grateful for the lesson even as I mourn the cost. The road stretches on ahead, and I am still driving it. Different now, but still moving forward. That is all I can do. That is all any of us can do. Keep driving, but drive carefully. Stop when you need to. Check when something seems wrong. Care about the strangers who share the highway with you. Honor the dead by living better than you did before. I have been hauling freight through the Midwest for 13 years, and I thought I knew every back road and shortcut between Kansas City and St. Louis. When you drive the same routes month after month, you develop an instinct for which roads will save you time and which ones will cost you hours sitting in traffic or construction delays. You learn where the state troopers like to set up their speed traps, which truck stops have the cleanest showers, which stretches of highway turn dangerous when the weather goes bad. But no amount of experience or local knowledge could have prepared me for what happened on a flooded county road in southern Missouri last spring, when a bridge that should not have existed became my prison, and the people who came to help me turned out to be something far worse than strangers. My name is Clint Everhart, and I drive for a small independent outfit called Heartland Hauling out of Springfield. We specialize in agricultural products and construction materials, the kind of unglamorous freight that keeps rural America running but does not get much attention from the big national carriers. It was late April, and I was bringing a load of fence posts and steel panels from a supplier outside of Joplin to a ranch operation near Rolla. The route should have been straightforward, just Highway 44 east for about 100 miles, but Mother Nature had other plans. The spring rains had been relentless that year, turning normally docile creeks into raging torrents and flooding roads that had been dry for decades. By the time I loaded up and got on the highway, the radio was full of warnings about flash flooding and road closures. Highway 44 had been shut down near Lebanon due to water over the roadway, and the recommended detour was adding 2 hours to everybody's drive time. I sat in my cab at a truck stop outside of Carthage, drinking bad coffee and looking at my road atlas, trying to figure out an alternative route that would get me to Rolla before the delivery window closed. My dispatcher had been clear that this customer was important, that they needed the materials first thing in the morning for a construction project that was already behind schedule. Missing the delivery would mean losing the account, and in a small operation like ours, losing accounts meant losing jobs. So I did what truckers have been doing since the first roads were built. I looked for a shortcut. The atlas showed a network of county roads running roughly parallel to Highway 44, winding through the hills and valleys of the Ozark Plateau. Most of them were marked as paved, and according to my calculations, stringing together the right combination of these back roads would save me at least an hour compared to the official detour. It was a gamble because county roads could be treacherous in bad weather, and there was no guarantee they would all be passable with the flooding. But I had a good truck. I had years of experience driving in difficult conditions, and I had the confidence that comes from thinking you know better than the authorities who plan the official routes. I finished my coffee, plotted out a course that would take me through a series of small towns I had never heard of, and pointed my freightliner east onto County Road J. The rain had eased to a steady drizzle by the time I left the truck stop, which I took as a good sign. The first 20 miles went smoothly, the county road winding through farmland and forest with only occasional patches of standing water that my truck handled easily. I passed through a couple of tiny communities, just a few houses, and maybe a closed-down gas station or a boarded-up general store. The kind of places that had been dying slowly since the interstate system pulled traffic away from the old roads. There were no other vehicles on the road, which made sense given the weather warnings and the late hour. It was pushing 8 o'clock in the evening, and most sensible people were home having dinner with their families instead of trying to navigate flooded back roads in the gathering darkness. Around mile marker 37, County Road J intersected with County Road M, and according to my atlas, this was where I needed to turn north for about 15 miles before picking up State Highway 32. The intersection was marked by a blinking yellow caution light that cast an eerie glow on the wet pavement, and I could see that County Road M climbed up into more heavily forested hills. The road's surface looked good, recently paved, and I could see drainage ditches on both sides that were handling the runoff from the rain. I made the turn and started climbing into the hills, my engine working harder as the grade increased and the curves became tighter. The forest closed in on both sides of the road, dense stands of oak and hickory with undergrowth thick enough to block any view of what lay beyond the tree line. It was the kind of country where you could hide just about anything, where the modern world had never fully penetrated, where old ways and old beliefs still held sway in the hollows and hidden valleys. I had grown up in Missouri, had spent enough time in rural areas to know that these hills had a character all their own, a sense of something ancient and patient that existed alongside but separate from the contemporary world of highways and cell phone towers and 24-hour news cycles. But knowledge and respect for a place do not always protect you from what it might contain, and sometimes the old roads lead to destinations that should have been left forgotten. About 8 miles up County Road M, my headlights caught something that made me start downshifting. There was water across the road ahead, a lot of water, spreading out in a dark sheet that reflected my lights like obsidian glass. I slowed to a crawl and eased forward, trying to judge the depth and the current. The road had descended into a small valley, and I could see that a creek had overflowed its banks and was running across the pavement in a torrent that looked maybe 6 inches deep, but was moving fast enough to kick up white water where it hit obstacles. On the far side of the flooded section, maybe 100 yards away, the road climbed back up into the hills and the pavement looked dry. It was a judgment call, the kind truck drivers make dozens of times on every trip. Play it safe and turn around, losing all the time I had saved by taking the back roads, or push through and hope my truck had enough weight and traction to handle the current. I sat there for a long moment, engine idling, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. The water did not look that deep, and I had driven through plenty of flooded low-water crossings over the years without any problems. My freightliner sat high off the ground with good tires and a loaded trailer that would give me traction. The smart play was probably to turn around, but I had not gotten this far by always making the smart play. Sometimes you had to trust your instincts and your equipment and your ability to handle whatever the road threw at you. I put the truck in its lowest gear and eased forward into the water, feeling the current push against my wheels as I entered the flow. The water was deeper than it had looked from a distance, rising up past my wheel wells and creating a bow wave that spread out ahead of my grill. But the truck was handling it, the weight of the load keeping me stable, the tires gripping the pavement beneath the rushing water. I was maybe 30 yards into the crossing when I felt the first serious push from the current, a lateral force that tried to shove the whole rig sideways. I corrected with the steering wheel and kept my speed steady, not too fast, or I would lose traction, not too slow, or I would give the current time to work against me. 50 yards, then 60, the far side getting closer. I was starting to think I was going to make it when the pavement beneath my wheels suddenly dropped away. It was not a gradual slope or a pothole, but a complete absence of road surface, like the flooding had undermined the pavement and washed away everything underneath. My front wheels hit nothing but water and empty space, and the nose of my truck dropped at an angle that sent everything in my cab that was not tied down sliding forward. I stood on the brakes, but there was nothing to brake against, just water and collapsing roadbed. The truck settled at a steep angle with the cab pointing downward and the trailer trying to pull the whole rig backward. Water was rushing around my doors and starting to seep in through the seals, and I could feel the current working to push me further off the damaged section of road. I grabbed my CB radio and started calling for help on Channel 19, but I was getting nothing back except static. The hills around me were blocking any signal, and there was probably not another truck within 20 miles of this isolated back road anyway. My cell phone showed no service, which did not surprise me given the remote location and the weather. I was on my own in a rapidly deteriorating situation with night coming on and the water level still rising. I tried backing up, putting the truck in reverse and giving it gentle throttle, but the wheels just spun uselessly. The pavement behind me was too slick with running water to give me any purchase, and the angle of the truck made it impossible to get enough weight on the drive wheels. I was stuck, and with every minute that passed, more water was flowing into my cab and the truck was settling deeper into whatever hole the flooding had created in the roadbed. I shut off the engine to avoid flooding it and sat there in the gathering darkness, listening to the rush of water and trying to think through my options. I could abandon the truck and try to walk back the way I had come, but that meant wading through fast-moving water in the dark with no guarantee that I would find help before hypothermia set in. I could stay with the truck and hope that the water level dropped or that someone came along to help, but that seemed like a long shot given the isolated location and the late hour. Or I could try to ride it out until morning and then reassess the situation in daylight, assuming the truck did not get swept off the road completely in the meantime. While I was running through these increasingly grim scenarios, I saw headlights approaching from the direction I had come. It was just a faint glow at first, diffused by the rain and the distance, but it was definitely getting brighter and closer. Someone else was on County Road M, someone who might have equipment or a radio that could get a message out to emergency services. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the cab into water that came up to my knees, cold and moving fast enough that I had to brace myself against the truck to keep from being swept off my feet. I waded around to the back of my trailer and started waving my flashlight, trying to signal the approaching vehicle. The headlights kept coming, slowing as they got closer to the flooded section, and I could make out the shape of a large truck, something along the lines of a dump truck or a utility vehicle. It pulled to a stop about 50 yards back from the water, and I heard doors opening and voices calling out, "Hey there, you stuck?" The voice was male, rough with age or cigarettes or both, carrying clearly across the water. I shouted back that I was stuck and needed help, that my truck was in a hole in the roadbed and I could not get any traction to back out. There was some discussion among the people at the truck, voices too low for me to make out the words, and then I saw flashlight beams playing across the water as they started making their way toward me. There were 3 of them, moving slowly through the current, dressed in heavy rain gear and work boots that suggested they knew what they were doing in these conditions. As they got closer, I could make out more details. The one in front was an older man, maybe in his 60s, with a weathered face and a gray beard. Behind him came a younger man, probably in his 30s, with the kind of build that came from years of physical labor. The third figure was a woman, also older. with her hair pulled back under a rain hat and an expression of concern on her face as she looked at my situation. They reached my truck, and the older man did a quick assessment of the problem, shining his flashlight down into the water around my wheels and shaking his head. "You picked a bad spot to cross," he said, not unkindly. "The creek undermined this whole section of road about a week ago. County was supposed to close it off, but I guess they never got around to putting up barriers. You're not the first person to get caught here." I asked if they had a radio or a phone that could call for help, and the older man smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "No need for that just yet. We work for the county road department. We were out checking on flood damage when we saw your lights. We can probably pull you out with our truck if you will let us hook up a chain to your frame." The offer seemed almost too good to be true, but I was not in a position to question good luck when it appeared. I told them I would be grateful for any help they could provide, and the younger man went back to their truck to get chains and equipment while the older man and the woman stayed with me. That was when I started noticing things that did not quite add up. Their rain gear looked old-fashioned, more like something from the 1970s or 1980s than modern high-tech fabric. The flashlights they carried were heavy metal models with incandescent bulbs instead of the LED lights everybody used nowadays. Most strangely, they did not seem particularly wet despite standing in the rain and wading through knee-deep water. The rain was hitting them and running off their gear, but underneath they looked completely dry, like the water was not quite making contact with them. I told myself I was just stressed and tired, that my perception was off because of the adrenaline and the fear of being stuck in a dangerous situation. But some deeper instinct was starting to send warning signals, a primitive awareness that something about this rescue was not right. The older man introduced himself as Elwood Trent, said he had been working on county roads in this part of Missouri for more than 30 years. The woman was Nadine Crowhurst, and she did not say much, just stood there watching me with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been something else entirely. The younger man came back with heavy chains and a come-along, and they started the process of getting me hooked up for a pull. Elwood directed the operation with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before, telling me where to attach the chain to my frame and showing the younger man how to set up the come-along for maximum pulling power. They worked efficiently despite the water and the darkness, and within about 15 minutes they had everything rigged up and ready to go. Elwood told me to get back in my cab and be ready to give it throttle when they started pulling, that the combination of their truck pulling and my wheels pushing should be enough to get me back onto solid pavement. I climbed back into my cab and started the engine, grateful to hear it turn over without any problems, despite the water that had been seeping into the compartment. Through my mirrors, I could see the three of them making their way back to their truck, and then I heard the larger engine roar to life. The chain went taut with a metallic singing sound, and I felt my truck start to move backward, inch by inch, the wheels finding purchase on something solid beneath the water. It was working. They were pulling me out. I gave it just enough throttle to help the process along, feeling the truck slowly climb back up onto the intact section of roadbed, the angle of the cab leveling out as all four wheels found pavement again. After about 5 minutes of steady pulling, I was completely clear of the flooded section and back on solid ground. I shut off my engine and climbed out to thank my rescuers, pulling out my wallet to offer them money for their help. But when I walked back to where their truck was parked, I got my first really good look at it, and my gratitude turned to ice in my veins. The truck was a late 1970s International Harvester, the kind of utility vehicle that county road departments used to use before they switched to more modern equipment. But this one looked brand new, or at least perfectly maintained, the paint fresh, and the chrome gleaming despite the rain and the mud. The problem was that it should not have been possible for a truck that old to look that new, not unless someone had put thousands of hours and dollars into a complete restoration. And county road departments did not restore old equipment for nostalgia. They replaced it with newer models that were safer and more efficient. I looked at the license plate and saw that it was an old Missouri format from the 1980s, the kind that had not been issued in decades. Elwood Trent saw me staring at his truck, and his smile widened into something that might have been amusement, or might have been something darker. "Nice old rig, is not it? They do not make them like this anymore. Used to be you could fix these things with a hammer and some baling wire. Now everything is computers and sensors, too complicated for an old mechanic like me to work on." I asked him how long he had been driving it, and he looked at Nadine like they were sharing some private joke. "Oh, a long time," he said. "A very long time. Longer than you might think possible." The younger man was unhooking the chain from my frame, and I noticed for the first time that I had not caught his name. When I asked, Elwood waved the question away. He does not talk much, never has, but he's good with chains and pulling stuck vehicles, and that is what matters out here on these back roads. Something about the whole situation was setting off every alarm bell in my head. These people had helped me, had pulled me out of a dangerous situation, but they were wrong somehow. The old truck, the vintage clothing and equipment, the way they did not seem quite solid in the rain, the odd comments and the private jokes. I thanked them again for their help and started walking back to my cab, suddenly very eager to get away from this place and these people and back to the main highway where things made sense. But Elwood called after me, his voice carrying across the water with a clarity that should not have been possible over the sound of the rushing creek. "You should not be on this road, Clint Everhart. This is not a road for the living anymore, has not been for a long time. But since you are here, since you drove into our territory, there are rules you need to understand. Rules that apply to everyone who crosses the bridge." I turned back to face him, my heart pounding, wondering how he knew my full name when I had never told him. "What bridge?" I called back. "There is no bridge, just a flooded, low-water crossing." Elwood pointed past my truck toward the far side of the flooded section, and I followed his gesture with my eyes. What I had thought was just a continuation of the road climbing up into the hills now looked different. In the darkness and the rain, I could make out the silhouette of a structure spanning the creek, an old steel truss bridge that definitely had not been there before. Or had it? Had I simply not noticed it in my panic about being stuck? But that did not make sense because I had been looking at that exact spot for the past hour, had been focused on reaching the far side, and there had been nothing but road and hillside. No bridge, no structure at all, just pavement and darkness. "That is the Blackwater Bridge." Nadine spoke for the first time, her voice soft but somehow penetrating, reaching me despite the distance and the weather. Built in 1952, collapsed in 1987 with a county road crew on it. 3 people died when it went down during a flood just like this one. Elwood Trent, master mechanic, Nadine Crowhurst, civil engineer, and a young man whose name was lost in the paperwork, just another laborer that nobody bothered to remember. We were inspecting the bridge when the water undercut the foundation and the whole thing came down. They never rebuilt it, just closed off this section of County Road M and routed traffic around, but the bridge is still here in its way, still standing in a place between what was and what is. And sometimes, when the conditions are right, when the rain is falling and the creek is running high, people find their way onto it. People like you, Clint Everhart. I wanted to run, wanted to jump in my truck and drive away as fast as the wet roads would allow. But my feet would not move, would not obey the commands my brain was screaming at them. I could only stand there in the rain, water running down my face, staring at the 3 figures by their impossible truck and the bridge that had appeared out of nowhere. Elwood started walking toward me, moving through the water with an ease that suggested he was not quite subject to the same physical laws I was. Nadine followed, and the young man came last, and as they got closer I could see that they were not quite solid anymore. The rain was falling through them instead of on them, and I could see the forest behind them through their translucent forms. They were ghosts. The people who had pulled my truck out of the hole, who had saved me from being swept away by the flood, were ghosts of a road crew that had died 37 years ago. The three ghosts stopped about 10 feet from where I stood frozen in the rain, close enough that I could see the details of their faces, but far enough that I would have to make a conscious decision to approach them or flee. Elwood Trent looked exactly like what he had been in life, a working man weathered by years of outdoor labor, with calluses on his hands that I could see even through his translucent form. Nadine Crowhurst had the bearing of someone who had fought to be taken seriously in a male-dominated field, her posture straight, and her eyes intelligent behind wire-rimmed glasses that sat on a face that flickered between solid and transparent. The young man stood slightly behind them, his features still indistinct, as if even in death he remained unimportant enough that the universe had not bothered to preserve the details of his appearance. I finally found my voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper against the sound of rushing water and falling rain. "You are dead. You died in 1987. How are you here? How did you pull my truck out?" Elwood smiled that unsettling smile again, the one that suggested he found something amusing about my confusion and fear. "Dead is a complicated word, Mr. Everhart. We are not alive in the way you understand it, that much is true, but we are not gone either. When the bridge collapsed and the water took us, when we drowned in the flood with our work unfinished and our warnings unheeded, something kept us here. The bridge, the road, the water, they all hold memory, and we are part of that memory now, as real as the steel and concrete that used to span this creek. We exist in the spaces between what was and what is, and on nights like this, when the conditions match the night we died, we become solid enough to interact with your world. Solid enough to help, or to hinder, depending on the circumstances." I tried to process what he was saying, tried to reconcile the impossible reality of standing in flooded water, talking to ghosts with the rational worldview I had built over 43 years of living. But the evidence was right in front of me, translucent and flickering but undeniably present, and I could not deny what my eyes were showing me, even if my mind rebelled against accepting it. Nadine took a step closer, and I instinctively backed away, my boots slipping on the wet pavement. She held up her hands in a placating gesture, and I noticed that the rain was falling through her palms like they were made of smoke. "We are not here to hurt you, Mr. Everhart. We pulled your truck out because that is what we do. We were road workers in life, and in death we maintain the road still. But there is a price for our help, a toll that must be paid by anyone who receives assistance from the crew of Blackwater Bridge. You accepted our help. You allowed us to hook our chains to your vehicle and pull you to safety. That creates an obligation, a connection that cannot be easily broken. You are bound to this place now, at least for tonight, and there are things you need to understand about the bridge and the rules that govern it." I wanted to argue, wanted to tell them I had not asked to be bound to anything, that I had just been a driver trying to get unstuck from a dangerous situation. But I knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that protesting would be useless. I had driven onto their road, had accepted their help, and whatever supernatural economics governed the relationship between the living and the dead in this place, I was now in debt. Elwood must have seen the acceptance on my face because he nodded approvingly. "Good. You are smarter than some who have come before you. Some people try to run, try to get back in their vehicles and drive away. That never works out well for them. The bridge does not let go easily, and those who try to leave before paying their toll often find themselves driving in circles, passing the same mile markers over and over, unable to escape this stretch of road until exhaustion or madness takes them. The young man moved then, walking past Elwood and Nadine towards the bridge that had appeared out of the rain and darkness. He beckoned for me to follow, a gesture that was somehow both invitation and command. I looked at my truck sitting on the solid pavement behind me, engine off but still warm, my route to escape and normalcy. Then I looked at the three ghosts and the bridge beyond them, at the supernatural trap I had driven into through my own impatience and bad judgment. Some part of me knew that if I tried to leave now, if I got in my truck and attempted to drive away without fulfilling whatever obligation these ghosts believed I owed them, I would not make it. The road would keep me here, would loop me back to this exact spot no matter which direction I drove. I had heard stories over the years from other truckers, tales about haunted stretches of highway where drivers got turned around and lost, where the normal rules of geography stopped applying. I had always dismissed those stories as folklore, or the product of exhausted minds making sense of navigation errors. But standing here with ghosts who pulled trucks out of floodwater, I understood that some of those stories had been true. The road had places where it touched something older and stranger than asphalt and engineering, and I had driven into one of those places with my eyes wide open and my GPS useless. I took a deep breath and started walking towards the bridge, following the young man, while Elwood and Nadine fell in on either side of me like an honor guard or an escort of prisoners, I could not tell which. As we got closer to the bridge, I could see it more clearly despite the darkness and the rain. It was a steel truss structure, probably about 100 feet long, with the characteristic lattice of beams and supports that engineers had favored in the mid-20th century. The metal was rusted in places, showing the decay of decades exposed to weather. But the overall structure looked sound, solid, like it could still carry traffic if anyone had the courage to drive across it. But I knew from what Elwood had told me that this bridge had collapsed in 1987, that it had fallen into the creek during a flood and killed the three people now walking beside me. The bridge I was looking at should not exist, or at least should not exist in any physical form. It was a ghost, like its caretakers, a memory made solid by the right combination of weather and darkness, and the presence of someone living who could perceive it. We reached the approach to the bridge, and I could see that the roadway leading onto it was the same aged pavement as the rest of County Road M, complete with faded centerline paint and patched cracks. At the threshold where the road surface gave way to the bridge deck, there was a change in the air, a kind of pressure or temperature shift that I felt more than saw. It was like walking through a doorway between rooms kept at different temperatures, except the change was not just physical, but metaphysical, a crossing from one state of reality into another. I hesitated at that threshold, some animal instinct screaming at me not to cross it, not to put myself fully into whatever space the bridge occupied. But the young man was already on the bridge deck, looking back at me with eyes that held an expression I could not read, and Elwood's hand was on my shoulder, not pushing, but guiding, encouraging me forward into the space between the living world and wherever the dead resided. I stepped onto the bridge and immediately felt the difference. The rain stopped falling, or at least stopped falling on me, though I could still see it coming down beyond the edges of the structure. The sound of the rushing water faded to a distant murmur, and the darkness that had surrounded me became somehow thicker, more substantial, like I was walking through ink instead of air. The bridge deck beneath my boots felt solid enough, metal grating that rang with each footstep, but the handrails on either side seemed to flicker in and out of existence, sometimes solid steel, and sometimes nothing but outlines drawn in phosphorescent light. Nadine walked beside me and began to speak, her voice clearer now that we were on the bridge, like this place amplified her presence and gave her more substance. "The bridge was my design," she said, and there was pride in her voice mixed with bitterness. I spent 6 months doing the engineering work, calculating load capacities and stress points, making sure it would be safe for the heavy trucks and equipment that county roads have to handle. But I made a mistake. One small error in my calculations about the foundation, about how much erosion the creek bed could sustain before the supports became unstable. That error killed me and Elwood and the boy. That error brought the bridge down and left this stretch of road closed for 37 years. And that error keeps us here, bound to this place, unable to move on until we finish the work we started. I asked what work that could possibly be, how ghosts could finish anything in a world they no longer physically inhabited. Elwood answered this time, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space of the bridge structure. We inspect, we maintain, we watch over this stretch of County Road EM and everyone who travels it, living or dead. When the county closed this section after the collapse, they did not just abandon the road. They abandoned the people who lived along it, the families in the hollows and the hills who depended on this route to get to town, to get to jobs, to get to hospitals when emergencies happened. Closing the road effectively isolated them, cut them off from the world, and some of them died because of it. Old folks who could not get medical care, kids who could not get to school, families who lost their farms because they could not get their products to market. We failed them twice, once by building a bridge that collapsed, and once by dying and leaving them without anyone to maintain the road. So now we stay. We help people who get stuck or lost on this section of road. We pull them out of floods and fix their flat tires and guide them through the darkness. And in return, they help us remember. They bear witness to what happened here. They carry our story forward so that we are not completely forgotten. We had reached the center of the bridge now, the midpoint where the structure spanned the deepest part of the creek. I could hear water rushing below us, though when I looked down through the metal grating, I could see nothing but darkness, an abyss that seemed to extend far deeper than any creek bed should go. The young man had stopped here, standing at the exact center point, and he was pointing downward into that darkness with one translucent hand. Elwood and Nadine stopped as well, flanking me again, and I felt Elwood's hand on my shoulder once more. This time with enough pressure that I could not have pulled away even if I wanted to. "This is where it happened," Elwood said quietly. "This is where the foundation gave way and the bridge started to fall." We were standing right here, the three of us, checking the supports like Nadine had ordered us to do because she had noticed some cracking in the concrete. We had maybe 10 seconds between when the first support broke and when the whole structure came down. 10 seconds to understand that we were going to die, that we had made mistakes that were going to cost us everything. The boy tried to run, tried to make it back to solid ground, but the deck was already tilting and he lost his footing. Nadine grabbed the handrail and held on, screaming into her radio for help that would never arrive in time. And I just stood here and watched it all happen. Watched the bridge that we had built and maintained and trusted turn into a trap that drowned us in cold water and darkness. Nadine took up the story, her voice tight with emotion even after 37 years of death. The water was so cold. That is what I remember most clearly, even more than the pain or the fear. The absolute shocking cold of floodwater in April. Cold enough to stop your heart, cold enough to paralyze your lungs. We went under still tangled in the bridge structure, trapped in the twisted metal and concrete as it sank to the bottom of the creek bed. I tried to free myself, tried to swim to the surface, but the steel beams had me pinned and the current was too strong. I drowned with my eyes open, watching the light from the surface get farther and farther away, knowing that I had killed us all with my mistakes and my arrogance and my certainty that I had done the math correctly. The young man turned to face me then, and for the first time I could see his features clearly. He was maybe 19 or 20, with a face that had not yet lost the softness of adolescence. There was a terrible sadness in his eyes, but also a kind of peace, like he had come to terms with his death in a way that Elwood and Nadine had not. He did not speak, but I heard his voice in my head somehow. Thoughts transmitted directly without the need for words. He showed me his last moments, the sensation of falling as the bridge deck gave way beneath his feet, the impact of hitting the water, the desperate struggle to reach the surface while steel and concrete rained down around him. He showed me drowning from the inside, the burning in his lungs, and the darkness closing in, and the final moment when his body gave up and he breathed in water instead of air. And he showed me something else, something that Elwood and Nadine apparently did not know or had chosen not to share. He showed me that the bridge had not failed because of Nadine's engineering error. It had failed because the county had cut corners on the construction, had used substandard materials and skipped inspections to save money. Nadine's design had been sound, but the implementation had been flawed, and she had died blaming herself for failures that were not really hers. I staggered back from the force of these transmitted memories, feeling the young man's death like it was my own, feeling the water fill my lungs and the cold stop my heart. Elwood caught me before I fell, his hand suddenly solid enough to support my weight, and he eased me down to sit on the bridge deck with my back against one of the support beams. I was gasping for air, my heart racing, sweat mixing with rain on my face despite the fact that no rain was falling on the bridge. The experience of drowning, even secondhand, was more terrifying than anything I had ever felt, and I understood now why these three ghosts were bound to this place. They had died badly, violently, with their work unfinished, and their reputations ruined by an accident that was not entirely their fault. Nadine knelt beside me, her translucent form flickering in the darkness. "Now you understand," she said softly. "Now you know what we carry. The weight of it, the injustice of it. We died for someone else's greed and corner-cutting, but the official reports blamed us, blamed my engineering, blamed Elwood's maintenance, blamed the boy for being careless and falling even though he did everything right. The truth died with us in the water, and for 37 years we have been trapped here trying to make people understand what really happened. That is the toll we ask of those we help on this road. We ask that you listen to our story, that you bear witness to the truth, that you carry it forward into the world of the living where it might finally matter." I wanted to tell her that I would do it, that I would tell anyone who would listen about the bridge and the ghosts and the truth about how they died. But before I could speak, something changed in the air around us. The bridge began to shake, a low vibration that I could feel through the deck and the beams, and the sound of rushing water grew suddenly louder. Elwood stood up quickly, looking around with an expression of alarm that I did not like seeing on the face of a ghost who was supposed to be in control of this place. "The water is rising," he said, "rising faster than it should be. The same conditions that brought the bridge down in 1987, they are happening again. The creek is undercutting the foundations, and the structure is becoming unstable. We need to get off the bridge, need to get you back to solid ground before the memory collapses and takes you with it." But when I looked back toward the approach we had used to walk onto the bridge, I could see that it was no longer there. The connection between the bridge and the road had disappeared, leaving only a gap of darkness and rushing water. We were trapped on a structure that was about to collapse, surrounded by ghosts who could survive another drowning, but I could not. The toll they had asked for was not just my attention and my promise to bear witness. It was my presence here at the moment of their death, my participation in a reenactment that happened every time the conditions were right and someone living was foolish enough to accept their help. I was going to die on Blackwater Bridge, just like Elwood Trent and Nadine Crowhurst and the unnamed young man had died in 1987, and there was nothing any of us could do to stop it. The bridge shook again, harder this time, and I heard the groan of metal under stress. Nadine grabbed my arm, her grip somehow solid despite her translucent form. "Listen to me, Clint Everhart. Listen very carefully because I do not have much time to explain this. The bridge is a loop, a moment in time that repeats when the conditions are right. We died here, and we die here again every time someone crosses over, reliving our last moments in an endless cycle. But you are alive. You still have mass and presence in the real world, and that means you might be able to break the loop. If you can get to the center support, the one that failed first in the original collapse, and if you can mark it somehow, leave some physical evidence that you were here, it might anchor this memory to a specific time and place. It might stop the loop from repeating and let us finally move on." I did not fully understand what she was asking, but I understood that it was important and that my life probably depended on doing it. I asked her where the center support was, and the young man pointed toward the downstream side of the bridge, to a place where the main structural beam met the foundation pier. The water had risen enough that the bottom of the beam was now submerged, hidden in the churning flood, but I could see the top of it about 10 feet away from where we stood. I would have to climb over the handrail and out onto the support structure, hanging above rushing water in the darkness, with no safety equipment and no guarantee that the beam would even support my weight. But staying on the collapsing bridge was certain death, and at least this way I had a chance, however slim, of surviving and maybe helping these ghosts find whatever piece they were searching for. I stood up and started moving toward the handrail, but Elwood stopped me. "Wait," he said. "You need to understand something. If you do this, if you mark that beam and anchor the memory, we will be locked to the moment of our death permanently. We will not move on to whatever comes after. We will just stop, frozen in that final instant, aware but unable to act or change or grow. It is a kind of death for us, maybe the only real death that ghosts can experience. Are you willing to do that to us in order to save yourself?" I looked at the three of them, at Elwood with his weathered face and his builder's hands, at Nadine with her intelligence and her misplaced guilt, at the young man with his silence and his sadness. They had saved me from drowning in my truck, had pulled me to safety and asked only that I listen to their story, and now I was being asked to destroy them in order to save myself. The bridge shook again, and I heard the sound of metal tearing, of supports giving way. Time was running out, and I had to make a choice. I told Elwood that I was sorry, that I did not want to hurt them, but I wanted to live, that I had people depending on me, roots to drive, a life that was not finished yet. He nodded slowly, something like understanding in his ghost eyes. "We know," he said. "We would make the same choice if our positions were reversed. Go. Do what you need to do. And remember us, Clint Everhart. Remember that we were real people who died trying to do our jobs correctly. Remember that the bridge failed not because of our incompetence but because of someone else's greed. Tell that story to anyone who will listen. That is all we ever wanted. To be remembered accurately instead of as footnotes in an accident report that blamed the victims." I climbed over the handrail and out onto the support beam, my boots slipping on the wet metal, my hands finding purchase on the cross braces. The water rushed below me, maybe 15 feet down now and rising, and I could feel the bridge swaying with each surge of the current. I made my way along the beam toward the center support, moving carefully, testing each handhold before trusting my weight to it. The rain had started falling again, or maybe I had left the protected space of the bridge deck and was back in the normal world where rain still existed. It ran into my eyes and made the metal slippery, but I kept moving because stopping meant falling, and falling meant drowning. I reached the center support and looked for something to mark it with, some way to leave physical evidence that would anchor this ghost bridge to reality. My hand found the knife on my belt, a folding blade I carried for cutting straps and rope, and I pulled it out and opened it with fingers that were numb from cold and fear. I carved my initials into the painted metal of the support beam, CE, digging deep enough that the marks would be visible even after the paint weathered away. And as I carved, I felt something shift in the air around me, felt the bridge solidify and become more real, felt the loop that had held Elwood and Nadine and the young man prisoner for 37 years finally break and release them. The bridge stopped shaking. The water sounds faded. And when I looked back toward where the three ghosts had been standing, I saw nothing but empty deck and darkness. They were gone, released from their loop, moved on to wherever ghosts go when they finally stop being ghosts. I had saved myself and destroyed them, and I did not know whether to feel relieved or guilty about it. I climbed back onto the bridge deck and made my way toward what had been the approach, hoping that marking the beam had restored the connection to the real road. And it had. The approach was there again. Solid pavement leading back to County Road M, and my truck was sitting exactly where I had left it, engine cold now, but intact. I ran to it through the rain, climbed into the cab, started the engine with shaking hands. The truck fired up immediately, and I put it in gear and drove away from Blackwater Bridge as fast as the wet road would allow, not looking back, not wanting to see whether the bridge was still visible or had faded back into whatever liminal space it had occupied before I arrived. I drove for 20 miles before I allowed myself to stop shaking, before my hands relaxed their death grip on the steering wheel, and my heart rate dropped back to something approaching normal. County Road M had continued past the flooded section without any more supernatural encounters, eventually connecting to State Highway 32, just like my atlas had promised. But the road I was driving on felt different now, contaminated somehow by what I had experienced at Blackwater Bridge. Every shadow between the trees looked like it might hide another ghost. Every curve in the pavement felt like it might lead to another impossible structure that existed between the living world and whatever came after. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, and I could see the first hints of dawn beginning to gray the eastern sky. I had lost the entire night to my detour and my encounter with the dead, and my delivery window was shot to hell. But I was alive, and that was more than Elwood Trent and Nadine Crowhurst and the unnamed young man could say, even if my survival had come at the cost of their final destruction. I pulled into a truck stop outside of Rolla just after 6 in the morning, exhausted and still processing what had happened. The parking lot was starting to fill with the early risers, drivers beginning their days with coffee and breakfast sandwiches and the usual complaints about weather and traffic. Normal people doing normal things in a normal world where bridges stayed collapsed when they were supposed to be collapsed, and the dead stayed dead instead of pulling stuck trucks out of floodwater. I sat in my cab for a long time, watching other truckers go about their routines, wondering if any of them had ever experienced anything like what I had just been through. Wondering if the road held other secrets, other places where the barrier between worlds wore thin, and the past could reach out to touch the present. I had been driving professionally for 13 years, had logged hundreds of thousands of miles on every kind of road from interstate highways to dirt tracks that barely deserved to be called roads at all. But until last night, I had never questioned the fundamental nature of the roads themselves, had never considered that they might be more than just engineered surfaces connecting one point to another. Now I understood that roads had memory, that they held onto the events that happened on them, and that sometimes those memories became strong enough to manifest in ways that defied rational explanation. I called my dispatcher from the truck stop payphone and explained that I had been delayed by flooding and road conditions, that I would be late making the delivery but the cargo was intact, and I would get there as soon as possible. He was not happy about it, but he had worked with me long enough to know I did not make excuses lightly, and he told me to get some rest and make the delivery when I could. I did not tell him about the bridge or the ghosts, or the choice I had made to save my own life at the cost of destroying 3 spirits who had been trapped for 37 years. Some experiences are not meant to be shared, not because people would not believe them, but because believing them would change how they saw the world, and most people are not ready for that kind of change. I got breakfast in the truck stop restaurant, though I could barely taste the eggs and bacon and coffee. My mind kept replaying the moment when I carved my initials into the support beam, the feeling of the ghostly bridge becoming more solid under my hands, and the terrible certainty that I was ending something that should have been allowed to continue. Elwood had told me that breaking the loop would freeze them in their moment of death forever, aware but unable to act or change. What kind of existence was that? Was it better or worse than the cycle they had been trapped in, reliving their drowning over and over every time the conditions were right and someone living crossed their bridge? After breakfast, I went back to my truck and pulled out the road atlas, studying the page that showed County Road M and the surrounding area. There was no indication of any bridge on that section of road, just a notation that the route was closed to through traffic. I found a county map in the truck stop convenience store and checked it against my atlas, and the county map showed the same thing. County Road M was marked as a dead-end road, not connecting to anything beyond the point where Blackwater Bridge had stood. But I had driven through that section, had continued on County Road M past where the bridge had been, and had eventually connected to Highway 32 just like I had planned. The official maps said that route did not exist, but I had driven it, which meant either the maps were wrong or I had been traveling on a road that only existed in some parallel version of reality where bridges that collapsed in 1987 were still standing. I decided I needed to know more about what had happened at Blackwater Bridge, needed to understand the truth about the accident that had killed 3 people and trapped their ghosts for decades. The truck stop had free internet access in the driver's lounge, and I spent an hour searching for information about the bridge collapse. What I found confirmed everything the ghosts had told me and added details that made their story even more tragic. The bridge had collapsed on April 23, 1987, during a period of heavy spring flooding that had affected much of southern Missouri. The official accident report blamed the collapse on a combination of factors including foundation erosion, structural fatigue, and inadequate inspection protocols. 3 county workers had been killed in the collapse: Elwood Trent, age 56, a master mechanic with 32 years of service; Nadine Crowhurst, age 41, a civil engineer who had designed the bridge during her first year with the county; and an unnamed laborer whose identity had been lost in the paperwork confusion following the accident. The report had been particularly harsh on Nadine, suggesting that her engineering calculations had been flawed and that she should have recognized the vulnerability of the foundation to erosion. Reading between the lines of the dry, bureaucratic language, it was clear that Nadine had been scapegoated for the failure, blamed for mistakes that were really the result of cost-cutting and corner-cutting during construction. The young man's psychic transmission had shown me the truth, that substandard materials and skipped inspections were the real cause of the collapse, but the official record would forever blame the victims instead of the system that had failed them. I found a few newspaper articles from the weeks following the collapse, local coverage that provided more human details about the 3 people who had died. Elwood had been described as a dedicated worker who knew every mile of county road in the district, someone who could fix any piece of equipment with basic tools and ingenuity. He had been married with 2 grown children, and his family had sued the county for wrongful death, though the case had been settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. Nadine had been unmarried, one of the first female engineers hired by the county road department, fighting to prove herself in a profession that did not always welcome women. The articles described her as brilliant but difficult, someone who did not suffer fools, and who had made enemies among the old guard who resented her presence. The young man was mentioned only as an unidentified laborer, someone whose name had been left off the work crew roster and whose family had apparently never come forward to claim his body. That detail bothered me more than anything else I had learned. Elwood and Nadine at least had identities, had been remembered and mourned by people who knew them. But the young man had died anonymous, had been buried in a county cemetery with a marker that probably just said unknown worker, or something equally impersonal. Even in death he had been forgotten, reduced to a footnote in someone else's tragedy. No wonder he could not speak even as a ghost. No wonder his features remained indistinct. He had been erased so thoroughly from the record that even his spirit did not know who it was supposed to be. I felt a wave of guilt wash over me for what I had done to all three of them, but especially for the young man. He had finally found someone who could see him, who could acknowledge his existence, and I had destroyed him to save myself. The moral weight of that choice was going to stay with me for a long time, maybe for the rest of my life. I printed out copies of the articles and the accident report, thinking that maybe I could use them to tell the ghost's story, to correct the record and give them the recognition they deserved. But even as I gathered the documentation, I knew it would not be enough. The official version of events was set in stone, had been set in stone for 37 years, and nothing I said or did would change how history remembered Nadine's supposed engineering failure, or Elwood's supposed inadequate maintenance, or the young man's complete erasure from the record. I made my delivery to the ranch outside Rolla around noon, apologizing for the delay and helping the crew unload the fence posts and steel panels. The ranch foreman was understanding about the weather delays, said they had been dealing with flooding themselves and were just glad the materials had arrived at all. He did not ask why I looked exhausted and haunted, did not comment on the way I kept glancing back at my truck like I expected to see something that should not be there. Truckers learned not to ask too many questions about each other's private troubles, learned to respect the unspoken code that everyone carried their own burdens, and sometimes those burdens were not meant to be shared. After the delivery, I should have headed back to Springfield, should have returned to my dispatcher and picked up my next assignment. But instead I found myself driving back toward County Road M, back toward the section where Blackwater Bridge had stood, driven by a need to see the place again in daylight and confirm that what I had experienced was real. The route looked completely different in afternoon sunshine, just another rural road winding through the Missouri hills. I found the intersection where I had turned onto County Road M, recognizing it by the blinking yellow caution light, and I followed the route back to where I had gotten stuck in the flooded section. The water had receded significantly since last night, and I could see the place where my truck had been trapped, the depression in the roadbed where the pavement had been undermined by the creek. There were orange traffic cones around the damaged section now, warning markers that should have been there last night, and I wondered if the county had placed them this morning, or if they had always been there and I simply had not seen them in the darkness and the rain. I parked on the shoulder and walked to where the bridge should have been, where I had crossed over into the space between worlds and made my terrible bargain with the dead. But there was no bridge, just the creek running through its normal channel about 30 feet below the road level. The banks showed evidence of flooding, mud and debris scattered on the slopes, but there was no sign of any structure, no remnants of twisted steel or broken concrete. I climbed carefully down the embankment, using tree roots and rocks for handholds, until I reached the creek bed. The water was still running high but was passable, moving fast, but only a couple of feet deep. I waded across, looking for any evidence of the bridge foundation, any physical proof that a structure had once spanned this creek. And I found it. On the far bank, partially buried in mud and debris, was a concrete pier, old and weathered and covered in moss. It was maybe 4 feet tall and 2 feet square, the kind of foundation support that would have held up a bridge truss. I brushed away some of the mud and saw markings carved into the concrete, letters and numbers that indicated when it had been poured. April 1952, the same year Nadine had said the bridge was built, and below those markings, scratched more recently into the weathered surface, were my initials, CE. The marks I had carved into the metal support beam last night were here in the concrete foundation, transferred somehow from the ghost bridge to its physical remnant, which meant it had all been real, not a hallucination or a dream, but an actual encounter with the dead in a place where the boundaries between worlds had worn thin enough for crossing. I stood there in the creek bed looking at those initials for a long time, running my fingers over the rough concrete and trying to process what it meant. I had destroyed 3 ghosts to save my own life, had broken a loop that had been running for 37 years, and the evidence of my choice was carved into a foundation pier that should have been demolished decades ago. Elwood and Nadine and the young man were gone now, not recycling through their deaths anymore but frozen in that final moment, aware but unable to act. I had done that to them. I had made that choice, and I would have to live with the consequences of it for whatever time I had left. I heard a voice call down from the road above, and I looked up to see a county sheriff's deputy standing at the edge of the embankment. He asked if I was all right, if I needed help getting back up to the road. I told him I was fine, just looking at the old bridge foundation, and he nodded like that was a perfectly normal thing for a truck driver to be doing. He waited while I climbed back up the embankment, and when I reached the road he introduced himself as Deputy Carson and asked what had brought me to this particular spot. I told him about getting stuck in the flooded section last night, about being pulled out by a county road crew, and about wanting to come back and see the place in daylight. His expression changed when I mentioned the road crew, a flicker of something that might have been recognition or concern. He asked me to describe the people who had helped me, and I gave him descriptions of Elwood and Nadine and the young man, watching his face carefully to see how he reacted. Deputy Carson was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke his voice was careful, measured, like he was choosing his words very deliberately. He told me that there was no county road crew working this section last night, that the flooding had kept everyone off the back roads until this morning, when they started putting up warning markers. He also told me that the descriptions I had given matched 3 people who had died in a bridge collapse on this exact spot in 1987, though I probably knew that already based on how I was looking at him. He said I was not the first person to report being helped by a phantom road crew on County Road M, that there had been maybe a dozen similar accounts over the years, usually during flood conditions and usually at night. Most people did not report their experiences because they thought no one would believe them, but the sheriff's department kept informal records of the sightings, a file that was not exactly official but was not exactly secret either. Deputy Carson asked me if the ghosts had hurt me or threatened me in any way, and I told him no, that they had just pulled my truck out and asked me to listen to their story. I did not tell him about the bridge appearing, or about being trapped in the death loop, or about carving my initials into the support beam. Some details were better kept private, and I was not ready to share the full truth of what had happened to me on Blackwater Bridge. The deputy seemed satisfied with my abbreviated account, said he was glad I had made it through safely, and warned me that County Road M was going to be closed for at least a week while they repaired the damaged section of roadbed. He also mentioned that there were rumors about demolishing the old bridge foundation, that some engineer from the state had suggested removing it completely to improve drainage and reduce erosion. The project was caught up in budget discussions and environmental reviews, but it might happen within the next year or two. When he said that, I felt a cold certainty settle into my bones. If they demolished the bridge foundation, if they removed the concrete piers that were the last physical remnants of the structure Nadine had designed and Elwood had maintained, then the ghosts would have nothing to anchor to. They were already frozen in their final moment, already destroyed by what I had done, but at least they still existed in some form, bound to the physical remains of their bridge. Remove those remains and they would be completely erased, scattered into whatever void claimed spirits that had nowhere left to haunt. I asked Deputy Carson if there was any way to stop the demolition, if there was historic preservation status or something that could protect the old foundation. He looked at me strangely, probably wondering why a truck driver from Springfield cared so much about some old concrete piers in a creek bed. But he told me that the bridge was not considered historically significant, that it was just one of hundreds of similar structures built in the 1950s, and that preservation efforts were focused on bridges that were still standing and could potentially be restored to use. The Blackwater Bridge Foundation was just debris as far as the county was concerned, something that interfered with water flow and created erosion problems, better removed than maintained. I thanked the deputy for his time and got back in my truck, knowing there was nothing I could do to save the bridge foundation from eventual demolition. The ghosts I had destroyed by breaking their loop would be completely erased within a year or two, and there would be nothing left to mark their existence except some old newspaper articles and an accident report that blamed them for their own deaths. I had given them the gift of ending their suffering, of breaking the cycle that kept them trapped, but I had also doomed them to complete oblivion. As I drove away from County Road M for what I knew would be the last time, I found myself thinking about memory and erasure, about how quickly people could be forgotten once the physical evidence of their existence disappeared. Elwood Trent had worked for the county for 32 years, had maintained hundreds of miles of road, had probably helped thousands of stranded motorists during his career. Nadine Crowhurst had designed a bridge that should have stood for decades if it had been built according to her specifications, had fought to be taken seriously in a profession that did not welcome women. The young man, whose name had been lost to paperwork errors, had shown up for work and done his job and died for it, anonymous even in death. And now they would all be erased completely, reduced to a footnote in local folklore, the phantom road crew that supposedly helped stranded travelers on flooded nights. Their truth would disappear with the bridge foundation, buried under new pavement and forgotten by everyone except maybe me. I drove back to Springfield in silence, no radio to distract me from my thoughts, just the hum of my engine and the whisper of tires on wet pavement. When I got back to the Heartland hauling office, I filed my trip report and collected my pay, and told my dispatcher I needed a few days off to deal with some personal matters. He looked at me like he knew something significant had happened, but was professional enough not to pry, just told me to take whatever time I needed and check in when I was ready to go back on the road. I went home to my apartment and spent 3 days trying to process what had happened, trying to come to terms with the choices I had made and the consequences those choices would have. I had survived my encounter with the ghosts of Blackwater Bridge, but the survival had cost me something I could not quite define. Some innocence, maybe, or some certainty about the nature of reality. I had driven into a place where the rules I understood did not apply, where the dead could pull trucks and bridges could exist in multiple states simultaneously, and I had come out of the other side changed in ways I was only beginning to understand. The road had taught me that it held more than just asphalt and paint, that it carried memory and pain and the unquiet spirits of people who had died before their time. And once you learned that lesson, once you understood that the familiar highways and back roads you traveled every day contained depths and dangers beyond the physical, you could never drive the same way again. Every mile marker became a potential gateway, every shadowed curve a possible threshold to somewhere else, and every stranded motorist a test of whether you would stop and help or drive past to preserve your own ignorance and safety. On the fourth day, I went back to work, picked up a load of construction materials heading east, and pointed my truck toward the interstate. But I drove more carefully now, more attentively, watching the road not just for traffic and hazards, but for signs of the supernatural, for indications that I was approaching another place where the barrier between worlds wore thin. I never took County Road M again, never even drove past the intersection where that whole nightmare had begun. Some roads are better left behind, some shortcuts are not worth the time they save, and some debts are too heavy to carry forward into normal life. I had paid my toll to the ghosts of Blackwater Bridge, had given them what they asked for, and then destroyed them to save my own life. That was a transaction that could never be balanced, a moral equation that had no right answer. I could only carry the weight of it and try to be worthy of the survival I had purchased with their destruction. The road stretched ahead through the gathering dusk, and I followed it toward destinations that were mapped and known and safe. But I never forgot what I had learned in the rain and darkness of County Road M, never stopped believing that the road held more than physics could explain. And I never stopped wondering whether Elwood Trent and Nadine Crowhurst and the unnamed young man were still frozen in their final moment somewhere beneath the water, aware but unable to act, waiting for demolition to scatter them completely into the void. That wondering was my burden to carry, my toll for driving away alive from a bridge that should not have existed in a place that existed between memory and forgetting. 6 months passed before I returned to County Road M. 6 months of driving other routes, hauling freight through states that did not border Missouri, taking assignments that kept me as far from southern Missouri as the dispatcher could arrange without making it obvious I was avoiding something. But avoidance has a cost, and eventually my refusal to take Missouri runs started affecting my standing at Heartland Hauling. The dispatcher called me into his office one morning in late October and asked me straight out what my problem was with Missouri routes, whether I had gotten a DUI there or had an angry ex-wife waiting to serve me papers or some other concrete reason for avoiding an entire state. I could not tell him the truth, that I was afraid of driving past County Road M because I might see 3 ghosts standing in the road or find myself on a bridge that had collapsed 37 years ago. So I told him I would take the next Missouri run that came up, and 2 days later I was hauling agricultural equipment from Springfield to a farm supply distributor in Rolla, the exact same route I had been running the night I encountered Blackwater Bridge. I left Springfield just after dawn on a clear October morning, the kind of day when the air is crisp and the light has that particular quality that makes everything look sharper and more defined. The fall colors were at their peak in the Ozark Hills, the maples and oaks turning brilliant shades of red and gold that made the landscape look like it was on fire. It should have been a beautiful drive, the kind that reminds you why you became a trucker in the first place, why you chose a life on the road despite the long hours and the time away from home. But I could not appreciate the scenery because I was too focused on watching for the intersection with County Road M, too anxious about what I might find when I reached the section where the bridge had been. I had checked the county records before leaving, had called the road department to ask about the status of County Road M and the old bridge foundation. The clerk I spoke with told me that the section was still officially closed through traffic, that the damaged roadbed from the spring flooding had been repaired, but the route had never been reopened. She also mentioned that the demolition of the old bridge foundation had been approved and was scheduled to begin in November, just a few weeks away. The concrete piers that had stood for 73 years would be broken up and removed. The creek bed would be regraded to improve drainage, and the last physical remnant of Blackwater Bridge would disappear as completely as the ghosts I had destroyed. I told myself I was driving past just to see the place one more time before it was gone, to pay my respects to 3 people who had died trying to do their jobs correctly. But the truth was more complicated than that. Some part of me needed to know if they were really gone, if breaking the loop had truly destroyed them, or if they might still be there in some form, frozen in their final moment, but somehow aware of my presence. I needed to know if the choice I had made that rainy April night had been the right one, or if I had simply traded their eternal suffering for my own temporary survival. The intersection with County Road M came up faster than I expected, marked by the same blinking yellow caution light I remembered from 6 months ago. I slowed down and made the turn, driving north on the county road into the hills, following the route that had led me to the bridge. The pavement looked better than it had in April, recently resurfaced in some sections, with fresh paint on the center line and new reflective markers on the curves. The county had clearly done some maintenance work over the summer, making the road safer for the local residents who still depended on it, even though it was officially closed to through traffic. I passed a few houses and farms, saw people working in their yards and children playing in driveways, normal rural life continuing in the shadow of a place where the supernatural had reached through into the everyday world. About 8 miles up County Road M, I saw the warning signs ahead. Large orange barriers blocked the road completely, with a digital message board flashing a notice that the route was closed for construction. I pulled over and got out, walking up to the barriers to read the posted information. The notice said that the road would be closed for approximately 2 weeks for bridge demolition and creek restoration work, that local traffic could use an alternate route marked on an attached map, and that through traffic should use State Highway 32 instead. The demolition had started early, I realized. The county had decided not to wait until November, but had begun the work in October, probably taking advantage of the dry weather and low water levels in the creek, which meant the bridge foundation was already being destroyed, the concrete piers broken up by heavy equipment, the last physical anchor for 3 ghosts scattered into rubble and dust. I should have turned around then, should have accepted that I was too late to see the place one final time, that the chapter had closed and all I could do was carry the memory forward. But instead I moved one of the barriers aside, just enough to let my truck pass through, and continued up the closed road toward where Blackwater Bridge had stood. I told myself I would only go far enough to see the work site, that I would stay in my truck and observe from a distance, that I would not do anything foolish or dangerous. But even as I made these promises to myself, I knew I was lying. I was driving toward confrontation with something I had been avoiding for 6 months, and I would not leave until I understood what had become of the 3 people whose final destruction I had caused. The work site came into view around a curve about 2 miles past the barriers. There were several pieces of heavy equipment parked on the shoulder, a hydraulic excavator and a couple of dump trucks, along with a work trailer that probably served as an office for the construction crew. But there was no activity, no workers moving around the site, no sound of engines or breaking concrete. The equipment sat silent and abandoned, as if the crew had left in the middle of a shift and never come back. I parked my truck behind the dump trucks and got out, immediately noticing how quiet everything was. The normal background sounds of the forest, the birds and insects and rustling leaves, were completely absent. It was the kind of silence that feels unnatural, oppressive, like the air itself has become too thick to carry sound properly. I walked toward the edge of the road where the embankment dropped down to the creek, and I could see that the demolition work had begun. One of the concrete piers had been partially broken up, the hydraulic hammer having cracked through the weathered surface to reveal the rebar and aggregate inside. But the work had stopped halfway through, the pier still standing but mortally wounded, and the excavator sat next to it with its arm extended like it had frozen in mid-strike. I looked for a safe way down the embankment and found a worn path that probably dated back to when the bridge was still standing, a route that local kids or fishermen had used to access the creek. I started down carefully, using the same tree roots and rocks I had used 6 months ago, and as I descended, I felt the temperature drop and the silence deepen, like I was passing through a barrier into a space where normal physical laws did not fully apply. The creek bed looked different than it had in April. The water was lower now, barely a trickle compared to the flooding torrent that had trapped my truck, and I could see features of the landscape that had been hidden before. The concrete piers were more visible, standing like ancient monuments in the shallow water, and I could see the abutments on both banks where the bridge deck had once rested. But what drew my attention was the figure standing next to the partially demolished pier, a man in work clothes holding a sledgehammer, his form flickering between solid and translucent in the autumn sunlight. It was Elwood Trent, or what remained of him after I had broken the loop and frozen him in his final moment. He was not moving, not breathing, just standing there like a statue made of fog and memory, his face locked in an expression I could not quite read. I approached him slowly, my heart pounding, not sure if he could see me or if he was trapped so completely in that frozen instant that nothing from the outside world could reach him. When I got close enough to speak, I said his name, and his eyes moved. Just his eyes, tracking toward me while the rest of his body remained perfectly still, and in those eyes I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. He was aware, conscious, trapped in a moment that would never end, but still able to perceive what was happening around him, still able to recognize me as the person who had done this to him. I wanted to apologize, wanted to tell him I was sorry for breaking the loop and destroying whatever chance he might have had for peace or resolution. But before I could speak, I heard other sounds in the creek bed, movement behind me, and I turned to see Nadine Crowhurst and the young man emerging from the shadows under the bridge abutment. They were frozen too, locked in their final positions. Nadine with one hand reaching for a railing that no longer existed, and the young man with his mouth open in a scream that would never finish. But their eyes were alive, tracking me as I backed away, and I could see in their gazes a mixture of emotions that was more complex than simple anger or accusation. There was pain, certainly, and betrayal, and a terrible sadness at what I had done. But there was also something else, something that might have been gratitude or relief or understanding. They had been trapped in a loop for 37 years, dying over and over every time someone crossed their bridge, and I had ended that cycle even if the cost was freezing them forever. I had given them a kind of release, even if it was not the peaceful transition to whatever comes after death that they might have hoped for. At least they were not drowning anymore. Were not experiencing that terrible moment of the bridge collapsing and the water closing over their heads and the darkness taking them. They were frozen, yes, but frozen after the worst was over. Frozen in a moment of aftermath, rather than a moment of active dying. "I am sorry," I finally managed to say, my voice sounding too loud in the oppressive silence. "I did not know what else to do. You were going to collapse again. The bridge was coming down, and I was going to die with you. I had to choose between your suffering and my survival, and I chose myself. I have been living with that choice for 6 months, carrying the weight of it, knowing that I destroyed you to save my own life. And now they are going to demolish what is left of your bridge, going to scatter the last physical remnants of what you built and maintained, and there will be nothing left to prove you ever existed except some old newspaper articles and a trucker who will spend the rest of his life wondering if he did the right thing." Elwood's eyes blinked, a slow, deliberate motion that suggested enormous effort, like even that small movement required more energy than his frozen form possessed. And somehow, impossibly, he spoke. Not with his mouth, which remained locked in its final position, but directly into my mind the way the young man had communicated through psychic transmission. The voice was faint and distorted, like a radio signal from very far away, but the words were clear enough to understand. You did what you had to do. We do not blame you for surviving. We would have made the same choice. But you need to understand something, Clint Everhart. You did not destroy us. You changed us, freed us from the loop, but bound us to this moment. And that binding has given us something we never had before. Time to think, time to understand what happened to us, time to accept our deaths and what came after. Nadine's voice joined Elwood's, another faint signal reaching across the gap between life and death. We have had 6 months to process what you did. 6 months frozen in this instant to examine our lives and our deaths and the choices that led us here. And we have reached certain conclusions. We were not innocent victims of a flawed system. We were complicit in the failures that killed us. I ignored warning signs about the Foundation because I wanted to prove I could design a bridge that would last. Elwood ignored maintenance issues because he was tired and ready to retire and did not want to deal with more paperwork. The boy, whose name was Thomas, by the way, Thomas Merrick, he saw cracks in the support beams but said nothing because he did not want to seem like he was questioning his supervisors. We all made choices that contributed to our deaths, and the loop was forcing us to confront those choices over and over without understanding them. You freed us from that cycle, and in the stillness you created, we finally understood our own culpability. So do not carry guilt for destroying us. We were already destroyed. You just gave us the chance to accept it. The young man, Thomas Merrick, finally had a name after 37 years of anonymity, spoke last. His voice was stronger than the others, younger, less weathered by decades of ghostly existence. I have been nobody for so long that I forgot I was ever somebody. But being frozen gave me back my name, my identity, my memory of who I was before I became just another unnamed victim. Thomas Merrick, 19 years old, from a town called Drury that does not exist anymore. I died before I had a chance to become anything, before I could make my mark on the world. But at least now I know who I was, and that is more than I had when I was cycling through the loop. So thank you, Clint Everhart, for giving me back my name even if the price was eternal stillness. I felt tears running down my face, grief and relief mixing in equal measure. They did not hate me for what I had done. They understood the impossible choice I had faced and the consequences of the decision I had made. But that understanding did not make the situation any less tragic, did not change the fact that 3 people were frozen forever in a moment of death while I got to walk away and continue living. I asked them what would happen when the demolition crew finished breaking up the bridge foundation, when the concrete piers were reduced to rubble and hauled away. Elwood answered, his psychic voice fading even as he spoke. We will scatter, dissipate. Whatever energy has been holding us to this place will lose its anchor, and we will drift apart into whatever comes next. It might be oblivion. It might be transition to some other state. We do not know, and we are not afraid of finding out. We have been dead for 37 years. Whatever comes next cannot be worse than what we have already experienced. But there is something you can do for us before we scatter, something more important than apologies or guilt. You can tell our story, the true story, not the sanitized version in the accident reports. You can tell people that Nadine Crowhurst was a brilliant engineer whose work was undermined by cost-cutting, that Elwood Trent was a dedicated mechanic who made mistakes because he was human and tired, that Thomas Merrick was a real person with a real name who deserved to be remembered. You can make sure that when they demolish this bridge foundation, someone knows what really happened here and why 3 people died trying to prevent a tragedy they saw coming, but could not stop. I promised them I would tell their story, that I would write it down and share it with anyone who would listen. I told them about the research I had done, the newspaper articles I had found, the official reports that blamed them for failures that were not entirely their own. I promised that I would correct the record, that I would make sure Thomas Merrick's name was added to the memorial that marked the site of the collapse, that I would fight to have the bridge designated as a historic site, even if it no longer physically existed. They listened in their frozen stillness, and I could feel their gratitude reaching across the barrier between life and death, a warmth that cut through the oppressive cold of the creek bed. Nadine spoke again, her voice fading to barely a whisper. "The demolition crew will be back tomorrow morning. They left because they felt us here, felt the wrongness of this place, and their equipment started malfunctioning in ways that frightened them. But they will return with priests or shamans or whatever they think will protect them from ghosts, and they will finish breaking up the foundation. When they do, we will scatter. And this conversation will be the last communication between our world and yours. So listen carefully to what I am about to tell you, because it is the most important thing you need to understand. The road holds memory. Every road, not just County Road M, not just places where tragedies happened. Every mile of pavement and gravel and dirt remembers the vehicles that traveled it, and the people who built it, and the events that occurred along its length. Most of that memory is inert, inactive, unable to manifest in ways the living can perceive. But sometimes, when conditions are right, the memory becomes strong enough to create what you experienced at Blackwater Bridge. A moment pulled out of time, a place where past and present overlap, a threshold between worlds. You will encounter other places like this in your years on the road. Other bridges that should not exist. Other people who should not be there. Other moments when reality becomes thin enough to see through. When that happens, remember what you learned here. Remember that the ghosts you meet are not monsters or demons, but people who died with unfinished business, people who need someone living to bear witness to their stories. Help them if you can. Listen to them always, and do not judge them too harshly for the choices they made, because you cannot know what pressures they were under or what limitations they faced. Be kind to the dead, Clint Everhart, and maybe when your own time comes, someone will be kind to your ghost as well. The three figures began to fade then, their translucent forms becoming even more insubstantial, their psychic voices dropping to levels I could barely perceive. Elwood spoke one final time, his words coming from very far away, already halfway to wherever he was going. Drive carefully. Stop when others need help. Remember that everyone you meet on the road is carrying burdens you cannot see. And do not mourn us, Clint Everhart. We are finally free. Then they were gone completely, leaving me alone in the creek bed with the broken pier and the autumn sunlight and the knowledge that I had been given a gift I did not deserve. Three ghosts who had every reason to hate me for destroying them had instead given me forgiveness and understanding and a commission to tell their story. I climbed back up to the road and stood next to the excavator, looking down at the place where Blackwater Bridge had stood, and I made a silent promise to honor their request. I drove back to Springfield and spent a week writing down everything that had happened, from the moment I got stuck in the flooded section of County Road M to the final conversation with Elwood and Nadine and Thomas in the creek bed. I documented the truth about the bridge collapse, about the cost-cutting and corner-cutting that had caused it, about 3 people who had died trying to prevent a tragedy they saw coming. I sent copies to the County Road Department and the State Historical Society and several local newspapers, along with a request that Thomas Merrick's name be added to any memorial at the site. Some of my letters were ignored. Some were dismissed as the ramblings of a trucker who had spent too much time alone on the road. But a few people listened, and slowly the story began to spread. The county agreed to add Thomas Merrick's name to the records, officially acknowledging his existence and his death for the first time in 37 years. A local historical society placed a marker at the site of Blackwater Bridge, noting that it had collapsed during flooding in 1987 and that 3 county workers had been killed in the accident. The marker did not mention ghosts or loops or supernatural manifestations, but it told the truth about who had died and why, and that was what mattered. The demolition of the bridge foundation was completed in November as scheduled. I was not there to witness it, but I heard from Deputy Carson that the work went smoothly once they brought in some local clergy to bless the site and put the spirits to rest. The concrete piers were broken up and hauled away, the creek bed was regraded, and County Road M was eventually reopened through traffic with a modern low-water crossing that could handle flooding without trapping vehicles. I still drive through Missouri regularly, though I avoid County Road M when I can. Not because I'm afraid of encountering ghosts again, but because driving that road reminds me of the weight I carry. The knowledge that I survived an encounter with the supernatural by making a choice that destroyed 3 spirits who had been suffering for decades. That is a burden that does not get lighter with time, a moral complexity that has no resolution. I did what I had to do to survive, and they understood and forgave me, but forgiveness does not erase the consequences of our actions. Elwood Trent and Nadine Crowhurst and Thomas Merrick are scattered now, their energy dissipated, their consciousness released from the frozen moment I had trapped them in. Whether that scattering was oblivion or transformation, or transition to some other state of existence, I will never know. But I carry their story with me on every mile I drive, sharing it when I can, making sure they are remembered accurately instead of as footnotes and accident reports that blamed the victims. That is the toll I pay for surviving Blackwater Bridge, the debt I will carry for whatever time I have left on the road. And every time I see another trucker pulled over on the shoulder with their hazards flashing, every time I encounter someone who needs help on a dark highway, I stop. I always stop. Because that is what Elwood and Nadine and Thomas would have done. And the least I can do is honor their memory by being the kind of person they were trying to be when they died. The road goes on forever, holding memories and ghosts and stories that most people will never know, but I know them now, and I carry them forward into whatever miles remain.